Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the 11th episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Kakashi, come with me. Dark, bleak eyes shifted to Minato's outstretched hand, regarding it as something strange and foreign to him. After a moment he dismissed it and returned his gaze to his father's motionless form in the middle of the living room floor. You can't sit here forever, Kakashi, Minato said gently, and we're only going to the kitchen. Ever so slowly, Kakashi relaxed a little, lifting his hand to place it into Minato's. It was cold and crusted with dried blood, but Minato held it tight and pulled the boy carefully to his feet. Never before had a simple trip to the kitchen felt like such an important journey, and almost at once Kakashi stumbled dizzily and dropped back to his knees. A moment later, he was throwing up on the floor. Minato waited for the wretches seizing his small body to subside, and just as Kakashi looked ready to sink back to the floor in a daze, Minato scooped him up beneath the arms and carried him into the kitchen. He kicked the door shut to the living room and planted Kakashi on the counter beside the sink. There were no clean glasses in the cupboards, so he rinsed one out and filled it with water. Wash your mouth out with this, he said. Then drink it slowly. Kakashi obeyed mechanically, holding the glass in one hand as the other remained tightly fastened around the hilt of the bloody dagger. When Minato reached out to try and relieve it from him, Kakashi jerked it closer so violently Minato feared he would cut himself. Did you take that off your father? He asked him, easing back. The boy stared guardedly. It's mine. Yours? Minato tilted his head questioningly. It looks like your father's saber. Kakashi looked at it as well, silent for a moment. Dad said it used to be his father's and his grandfather's, and that one day it would be mine. He looked stolidly at Minato. So it's mine now. The police will probably want to have a look at it, Minato warned him. A touch of uncertainty pinched the corners of Kakashi's eyes. I didn't do it. No, I know. Minato smiled slightly and rubbed a hand over the boy's head. How long were you sitting there? If Kakashi knew the answer to this, he didn't give it. Instead he returned his gaze to his father's saber, or perhaps it was the blood that held his attention. It wasn't right for a child so young to be sitting there with hands covered in his own father's blood, but if taking the weapon off him would only cause distress, Minato didn't know what else to do. He filled the sink with warm water and handed a bar of soap to Kakashi. Use this, he said, hoping he would. Where does your dad keep his note paper? He realized he had used the present tense and he wondered if Kakashi noticed or cared. The situation felt far too surreal. He needed paper to send a message reporting the incontrovertible fact of Tsukumo's sudden death, and he still spoke as if the man was only momentarily absent. Regarding the soap bar impassively, Kakashi pointed to a drawer in the kitchen table. Inside were all the pens and notepad paper Minato needed, and he sat down to scratch out a simple message. Oddly, he felt no rush. None whatsoever. It didn't matter if help came now or in an hour or in 10 hours. Tsukumo was already gone and nothing was going to change that. He could sit there and choose his words carefully, mull over them once, and twice, and realize that once this message got out there would be no turning back. Right now it was just him and Kakashi sitting in the kitchen, and once he sent this message the house would soon be swarming. As far as the rest of the village was concerned right now, Hatake Tsukumo was still alive. Minato almost felt like keeping hold of this note might even make it true for a little while longer. Gradually he came to notice he'd been staring at his completed note for several minutes. Kakashi hadn't moved even once in that time, and Minato gradually forced himself back into motion, gathering the summoning scroll from his pouch to call up the fastest toad he held contract with. When it appeared with a puff on the kitchen table, Kakashi's gaze flicked up briefly, but even the appearance of a bright yellow amphibian could not hold his attention. I need you to take this note to the military police department, Gamachan, Minato said quietly. Please emphasize the request for discretion, you know what they're like. The toad saluted and disappeared in a whirlwind. It would only take a few minutes for the message to be received, and then perhaps half an hour or more for the military police department to arrive. It was going to be unpleasant, and Minato looked at Kakashi, wondering if he should get the boy out of the house and spare him the prolonged procedure. But he doubted Kakashi was ready to move anywhere yet. He still had not washed the blood from his hands. Minato pushed his chair back and the legs protested loudly against the floor in such a silent house. In 2 strides he crossed to the sink, pulled the saber from Kakashi's hands and placed it on the counter. Kakashi flinched and began to reach for it, but Minato seized his wrists firmly and pushed them into the water. The loamy soap suds shrank and faded and wreaths of blood filled the clear water, turning it red. That was when Minato realized not all the blood was Tsukumo's. Kakashi had been clutching the actual blade of the saber so tightly it had cut into his palm in several places. Never once did Kakashi wince in pain, nor did he resist as Minato dried him with a towel and hunted down the first aid drawer to begin applying antiseptic cream and clean gauze. "You're being very brave," he commented, watching Kakashi's strangely blank face. "But it's okay to be upset. Shinobi must abandon their emotions," Kakashi said, reciting straight from the Grade 1 book of guidelines given to all children in the academy. Minato paused. "It's just a guideline, Kakashi. No one really believes that anymore." When Kakashi didn't respond, he continued, picking up the bloody saber to dunk it beneath the water and run the tap over it to remove every last drop of blood. Kakashi looked at him. "You said the police would want to see it," he said. "It's yours, isn't it?" Minato responded. He was sure the police could just as easily imagine it covered in blood, and it wasn't like it was a murder weapon. It seemed pretty clear to him what had happened to Tsukumo. Once the saber was clean and dry, Minato tucked it into Kakashi's belt where it would do the least harm. After helping him off the counter, they sat at the table. "The police will probably want to ask you some questions," he told him. "But if you like, you can talk to me and then I'll talk to them for you." Kakashi picked at the bandages around his hands diffidently. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" It took so long for Kakashi to look up that Minato initially took his silence as a no, but after several long minutes of silence, filled only by the drip of the tap in the sink, Kakashi opened his mouth and took a breath. "He didn't go to bed last night. He stopped tucking me in so I didn't notice until I got up. A man came. He said there were bodies at the gate, loads of them, and that Iwa and the other villages were attacking. His son had died or something, and he said it was Dad's fault. He said Konoha was going to be beaten in this war because of him." "Who was this?" Minato asked, narrowing his eyes. Kakashi shrugged. "I was listening from upstairs and I didn't see him. Dad didn't say anything though and he just left. When I went down, Dad was being worse than usual. I tried to give him breakfast but he wouldn't talk to me." Small hands squeezed convulsively against the tablecloth as annoyance marred Kakashi's features. It was the first emotion Minato had seen from him so far. "I said he was an idiot and pathetic because he wouldn't defend himself to everyone. I said he was embarrassing me." Kakashi spread his hands flat again to examine the spreading bloodstains beginning to seep through the pristine white gauze. "I went away to see my friends. When I came back, he was like that." The frustration eased in his face, and he looked up plaintively at Minato. "I think he did it because of me. I made him do it." From the look on his face, it was clear that Kakashi really believed this, and Minato sat stunned, wondering if he might have even been right. No doubt Tsukumo had endured terrible blows to his esteem since his mission, and this final act could not be contributed to one single incident, but Minato felt physically sick to think of what it must have been like to be told by his own son that he was a pathetic embarrassment. Kakashi couldn't have known. A child this young couldn't have even meant it sincerely. And yet Minato could see the incredible guilt he must be enduring right now. He was going to take all the blame for this upon his shoulders. Like father like son, Minato thought with an inward sigh. This isn't your fault, Minato told him firmly, as earnestly as he could. Your dad wasn't well. None of this was because of anything you did or said, believe me. He hoped that was the right thing to say. Kakashi didn't appear to be any more or less comforted or anguished, and he sat quietly at the table, fiddling with his bandages morosely until through the house they heard a knock on the door. Minato hadn't closed it after him when he'd arrived, and a deep masculine voice soon followed, calling, "Hello? This is the police. We've had a report of an incident at this address." Minato touched Kakashi's arm gently. "Wait here," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "I'll take care of everything. It'll be all right, Kakashi." He didn't know it, but Kakashi took one look at his smile and believed him implicitly. Since the moment Minato had stepped into the house, Kakashi had known everything would be all right. His poor flawed father had been the bedrock of his life, and without him he felt stranded, left without any ground to walk on, but Minato had always been a more aloof figure, implacable and perfect, and the only thing left he had to hold on to. Kakashi trusted him, and he nodded somberly as Minato got up. "Yes, sensei." Minato passed a hand over his head like Jiraiya still did to him, and left the kitchen to greet the figures looming in the hall. He wasn't overjoyed to see Uchiha Fugaku, though he didn't doubt his professionalism. He was backed up by 3 other officers, including his wife, Mikoto, who was a far more welcome sight, though there were no smiles exchanged between them as Minato approached. "What's this about?" Fugaku asked, holding up the note Minato had written. "If this is because of another brick through the window, you can tell old Tsukumo to order new glass like everyone else." Minato's eyebrows lowered a fraction. Perhaps he should have been more specific about his request for assistance. He hadn't realized the police may have been called to this address several times in the recent past over vandalism. "This way," Minato said tightly, leading them into the living room. Fugaku's expression changed completely the moment he laid eyes on Tsukumo. Shock swiftly replaced irritation, only to be just as quickly supplanted by grim inquisitiveness. "I see," he said. Maybe he had more experience with these sorts of scenes that he recognized and accepted what he was looking at far more quickly than Minato. At his shoulder, Mikoto drew in a soft gasp. "Oh no," she whispered, perhaps thinking more of Kushina than for the man on the floor. Fugaku began to cross the room, but paused at the pool of vomit Kakashi had left behind. "What's this?" Minato shook his head. "Kakashi," he said simply. "The kid saw this?" "Shit. He's in the kitchen," Minato explained. Fugaku nodded once at Mikoto, who immediately went to the kitchen door and let herself in. Minato was a little relieved. Kakashi and Mikoto were mildly familiar. Through their mutual connection to Kushina, and a little feminine support might have been more helpful to the boy right now. A suicide? Fugaku wondered, plucking the note from Tsukumo's stiff fingers to read it. He looked down to examine the fatal injury. "Seppuku, huh? It looks self-inflicted, but where's the weapon?" "Kakashi took it," Minato said. "It was just a knife." Fugaku sighed loudly. "Kid's messing up my crime scene." "Then why don't we invite him back in and you can make him apologize?" Minato suggested curtly. "The weapon's not important here." Fugaku met his glare coolly. "I'll need to question the kid on what he saw." "You can question me," Minato said. "He's my student, I'm responsible for him, and he already told me everything." So Minato relayed the story, though there wasn't much to tell. Tsukumo had been tipped over the edge, either by the visit of the man who had lost a loved one, or by his own son. It seemed inconsequential to worry over the exact reason. The result was the same: Tsukumo was dead, and it was by his own hand. What if someone arrived after the boy had left? Fugaku pointed out once Minato had finished. He wasn't exactly popular, and the suicide note could be forged. Have you read it? Fugaku was holding it out, but Minato had been reluctant to pick it up in the first place. He accepted it now and read it because he had to, but he still felt strange, like the man at their feet was not truly dead when Minato could hear his voice inside his own head, speaking the words as he read them. Had I known that I was already dead, would not have mourned my life. May the dead find solace in my company. Minato released a slightly shaky breath. Does it sound like him? Fugaku wanted to know. Maybe. Did Tsukumo have a poetic edge? He had no idea. Is it even his handwriting? Fugaku pressed. I don't know, Minato said. You'd have to ask someone who knew him better, you'd have to ask Kushina. Oh, Kushina, how was he ever going to break this to her? Apparently Fugaku could read minds, or Minato's face was simply that obvious. It's our job to inform loved ones of what's happened here, he said with remarkable generosity, though the news was better off coming from someone other than Kushina's own detestable Fuguface. But right now we'll have to remove the body and have it autopsied to rule out murder or assassination. The body. That was all Tsukumo was now. Once a person, a familiar presence that had always been in Minato's orbit, terrorizing him and inspiring him, and making a permanent mark on his life, now just a thing. An it. A mess to be cleaned up discreetly like the patch of vomit nearby. Do what you have to do, Minato said faintly, turning away at last. Fugaku issued orders to his subordinates, asking for body bags and backup and a cordon around the house. Pretty soon everyone in the neighborhood was going to know something was up, and after that the news would spread. Hatake Tsukumo had killed himself. Everyone who had muttered behind his back and blamed him for the emerging war, would they be satisfied now? Minato left them to their work and returned to the kitchen where Mikoto was sitting with Kakashi, stroking his hair consolingly, though she appeared more upset than he did. As Minato joined them, Kakashi lifted his gaze to him. What happens to me now? He asked frankly. Your father will have made a will, Mikoto said, more familiar with the procedure than Minato. He'll have named a guardian for you. Do you have any aunts or uncles? Grandparents? No, he said simply. I don't get to choose. You're not of age yet, Minato explained. Kakashi turned his gaze back to the table. What if my guardian is the old woman who smells like flu? Minato and Mikoto exchanged looks over the top of his head, neither knowing what to say or even think. And between them Kakashi rested his brow against a curled fist and whispered one brokenly, bitter syllable. Great. Just as Minato had predicted, once the police cordon went up, the scavengers of gossip began to appear. Neighbors materialized in their windows and doorways, passers-by stopped and became bystanders. A crowd was forming. When Minato left he had to make his way through them, and he could tell from their whispers that they'd already figured out what had happened. Wonder what will happen to the boy. They say he's the one who started this trouble with IWA. Did the only decent thing, if you ask me. Poor man, he was a good neighbor. The news was spreading, which was why he had to leave now. Mikoto promised to take care of Kakashi and protect him as best she could from her husband's inquisition, and though Minato would have preferred to stay with Kakashi himself, there was someone else he needed to see. Someone who didn't deserve to hear about Tsukumo at the end of a chain of gossip. She would still be at the hospital. To Minato it may have felt like a whole day or more had passed since they'd parted ways, but the clock tower marked the passage of time as barely more than an hour. So much could happen in such a short time. Minato had to stop when he reached the hospital, separated from the street by its bands of regular lawns, and lean his hand against a utility pole to remind himself that the world wasn't really spinning faster than his feet could keep up with. He could look up and see the clouds skating slowly through the blue sky, and around him civilians drifted about their daily routine, most of them probably still unaware of what was happening at the border or even at the gates of the village. He was still standing there when he heard his name called. Normally the sound of Kushina's voice made his heart feel lighter, this time it only filled him with dread. He dropped his gaze from the sky to the redhead, all but skipping across the lawn towards him. "I did it," he heard her call. "She's going to be okay, I did it." Infectious delight spread across her face in the form of a wide grin, and the sight of it was like a knife through Minato's gut. She ran up to him and grabbed his hands in hers, squeezing them tight, and he attempted a wan smile in return. It was a poor imitation. He should have been pleased for her, instead self-loathing tore at him, knowing that he was going to take that smile from her face and cause he grief. "What's the matter?" Kushina asked, her smile fading a little as she looked attentively into his face. "Is it about the sealing techniques? I know you're probably really confused right now. I should have told you, I'm sorry." "No," he said quickly, frowning at the ground. He could never forgive himself for worrying about something as small and petty as sealing techniques today. "No, it's not that." "Then what?" Her eyes flicked over his face rapidly, searching it for an answer. Minato took a deep breath. "I went to see Tsukumo," he began slowly. "He wasn't mean to you again, was he?" she sighed. "I told you, you can't take him seriously. He's just moody because, Kushina." "No," he interrupted softly. "I went, but when I got there, he was dead, Kushina." He looked up to meet her gaze and saw nothing in her face flickered with surprise or shock, nothing. "He's dead." Telling her was not the difficult part. It was easy to put into words the facts of what had happened. The hard part was dealing with her reaction, and watching the confusion and denial lock behind her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she said quite calmly. "We spoke to him yesterday." She pulled her hands away from his and seemed to draw away from him without moving a single step. "He took his life this morning," he told her quietly. "He wouldn't do that," she said with flat refusal. "I saw him, Kushina. The police are at his house now with Kakashi." Something in her expression broke and she gave a start. Was it the mention of the police involvement or just Kakashi? She stepped away from him, looking down at the grass lawn around them as if she didn't understand why she was there, standing on it when she should have been somewhere else. Then she looked past him and began to run. "Wait, Kushina," he yelled to no effect. She was tearing away, feet pounding the street as his hair flashed out in streams behind her. Minato gave chase at once, calling out to her. Kushina was fast when she wanted to be, and Minato had trouble keeping up. She wouldn't slow down even when her flat-heeled pumps flew off her feet in the midst of her reckless dash. In fact, she didn't even appear to notice. Minato retrieved one from the middle of the dusty road and the other from over someone's garden wall, and hurried on after her, ignoring the odd looks from pedestrians as he shouted at her, "Stop and think." The police cordon stood no chance against her. She slammed through the crowd and dashed beneath it without hesitation and was already up the steps of the house by the time the officers registered. The breach. Minato had to shout them down, warning them it was okay, though he wondered if it might have been better if they'd intercepted her after all. Her mad run came to a halt at the archway of the living room. That was where Minato caught up with her, holding her abandoned shoes in his hands and faintly out of breath. "You shouldn't be here," he said. From inside the living room, Fugaku looked up at them dourly. "No, you shouldn't." Kushina was staring at the floor, but the body was gone. All that remained now was the thick blood stain in the mat, so dark it was almost black. "Where is he?" she whispered. "The coroner's already taken the body away for examination," Fugaku said. "It's on the way to the morgue." At once Kushina turned and bumped straight into Minato. He caught her shoulders firmly before she could break into another run. "You can't do anything," he whispered. "I have to see him. He's gone." "No," she cried, shoving him. "I talked to him yesterday. I said I would see him when I got back and he wouldn't do this." Is this not his handwriting? Fugaku asked, moving toward her with the suicide note outstretched. Kushina jerked around and snatched it from his hand without looking at him. She read it silently, holding it close to her nose. There were only 2 lines and yet her eyes moved over them back and forth, again and again, trying to take them in. Either it is or it isn't, Fugaku repeated with impatience. Yes, she said in a low, uncertain voice. But it doesn't make sense. Fugaku made no comment. He plucked the note from her rigid fingers and returned it to his pocket, leaving Kushina grasping at nothing. I don't understand, she whispered, staring at the blood-stained mats. Why would he do this? Minato touched her shoulder, gently guiding her back towards the door. We should go. There's nothing we can do here. He looked towards the kitchen door, now open, though the room appeared to be empty. Where's Kakashi? Fugaku glanced at him indifferently. Mikoto took him back to headquarters to see our counselors, he answered. She seems to think he needs it, but the kid looks fine to me, all things considered. If Kakashi was fine in Fugaku's eyes, Minato would have hated to see what he considered to be disturbed. Leaving the man to do his job, he steered Kushina back out into the hall and outside. She was malleable now, following him without question and impervious to the stares of the onlookers outside. He took her hand firmly in his own and led her away from the poisonous atmosphere around the house. Do you want to go home? He asked her, worry gnawing at him to see her face so closed and bewildered. Yes. Kushina said faintly, barely hearing him. Then in the middle of the street, she suddenly stopped. Minato looked back at her and saw her gazing at their joined hands. This is really happening, isn't it? A hard lump rose in his throat. Yes, he said deeply. He's gone. He's dead. Her glassy eyes began to fill and shimmer. I'm sorry. I didn't say goodbye. She looked up at him and blinked like she had only just realized she wasn't alone, and when she did, tears streaked thickly down her cheeks. What do I do? She whispered, mouth beginning to tremble. His body, the funeral needs to be, what about Kakashi? Minato moved closer, running his hands over her arms. We'll pick up Kakashi from headquarters. I don't care what the legal arrangements will be, for now he can stay with us. Don't worry about anything else. He touched her cheek, pushing the moisture of her tears away, only for fresh ones to fall. Remember when my father died? I didn't know what to do, but you were like a rock and helped me through it all. This time I'm going to be the rock. You're not that strong, she whispered, voice broken with the effort to hold back the hurricane inside her. I can see you crying too, Minato. A treacherous tear had escaped the corner of his eye and he dashed it away. He hadn't been immune to seeing Tsukumo reduced like that, and seeing Kushina's grief made him feel something he'd certainly never felt when his own father had died. I can't help it, he admitted. Good, she croaked, leaning into him to hide her face against his chest. It's too easy to forget you're human too sometimes. That was the last coherent thing she said for quite a while. There had never been a more solemn evening than that one. Minato's cooking was never well received, but tonight hardly any of them touched the instant ramen he'd whipped up. Kakashi, freshly rescued from the police, simply stared at his bowl with the same blank expression he'd worn when he'd been staring at his father's body. Kushina, usually so enthusiastic about ramen, attempted a few half-hearted bites before giving up and pushing the noodles around her bowl until the broth went cold. Even Minato was having trouble finding his appetite. One of their number was gone, dead, for good. None of them really knew how to deal with it. Shikaku says that the Hokage will be holding a memorial service tomorrow, Minato told them. It's for the ones who fell in the first wave, but they're now including Tsukumo. Kushina's chopsticks stabbed at her food. I'm not going, she said, rubbing eyes that, while dry, had been red and swollen for hours. You can't not go, Minato said, dumbfounded. He was your sensei. Memorials are for the living, not the dead, and I have no wish to listen to a mass of hypocrites cry crocodile tears over the man they helped kill, she said acidly. I can remember him perfectly well without being told to. Fine. I'll just take Kakashi and I'm not going either, said Kakashi evenly. Minato stared at him. What? Why? With a blasé shrug, Kakashi shook his head. I don't want to. Minato looked between his infuriating dinner companions and sighed. This is how you two want to pay your respects? If Kushina had the decency to feel guilt at this comment, she was interrupted by Kakashi's blithe question, when can I go home? He used the same tone as a bored child being held against his will. You can't, said Kushina, resting her head against her palm. She said no more than that, since it was a question that Kakashi had asked more than once that day, and no one knew what was going to happen to him now. For now, he was given Minato's bed to sleep in, and although Minato naturally assumed he himself would be taking the sofa, Kushina told him to stop being stupid. There was enough room in her bed for two. On any other night this would have made his heart skip a beat. Tonight, however, his heart was beating more slowly than he'd ever known it to, and lying on a bed beside his girlfriend with an arm looped around her middle was not enough to send his pulse racing when he knew how badly she was hurting. They lay awake most of the night, lost in their own thoughts. When at last Kushina broke the silence, he had to think hard for a minute to figure out what she had said. What? He mumbled, voice rough from lack of use. Kushina stirred, and turned in the circle of his arm to face him, nose close to his. Why would he do it? She whispered again. I don't understand it. Minato no more knew the answer to that question than she did. He was depressed, he said, after a moment of careful deliberation. Maybe he thought it was the only way out. And why would he do this to me? To his own son? She ducked her head, and in the darkness her hair rustled against the pillow. I don't understand it. I never saw it coming. You couldn't have. He stroked her hair, trying to soothe her. I should have, she sighed. I should have seen the signs for what they were. If I hadn't gone on that mission with you, or if we'd gotten back sooner I could have stopped. Enough, he admonished her sadly. Tsukumo didn't want to be stopped. You can't beat yourself up for not seeing things he probably hid from you and everyone else. If he wanted to kill himself, he was going to succeed one way or another. You're not to blame. Kushina was silent in contemplation for a long moment. Just when he thought she had finally gone to sleep, she said, Don't you ever do this, Minato. If it ever gets so bad you think you have to take your life, you have to come and tell me. I tell you everything anyway. That's why I love you, she responded, hugging him tightly with her head beneath his chin. I know I can trust you. In the end they barely snatched 2 hours of sleep before dawn, and they moved about their morning the same way they had the previous evening, sapped of life and energy, still trying to figure out how they went from there. At least despite their previous insistence, Kushina and Kakashi put on their mourning clothes and accompanied him to the village square where regiments of other mourners and well-wishers were gathered. There were more than he'd expected, but of course, not everyone was there for Tsukumo. The pictures of 15 others hung on the remembrance wall behind the Hokage, more than Minato had counted when he'd arrived back yesterday. Other casualties must have come in since then. And more would follow too. It was only a matter of time. They stood at the front of the crowd along with the other families and friends of the first war victims as the Hokage began the service. Minato could see Kushina checking the faces around them. Perhaps she thought the man who had confronted Tsukumo before his death was among these grieving relatives, the man who could have been responsible for pushing Tsukumo over the edge. Minato held her hand tightly. She had already lost so many people in her life that she didn't deserve this. She should have been spared this grief. Yet she seemed to be the only one who felt it, he thought, glancing down at Kakashi who stood impassively beside him. The boy had always been like his father, with dark unreadable eyes and a limited number of facial expressions that made it difficult to tell the difference between his teasing and his serious remarks. The Hokage family played things close to their chest and avoided strong public displays of emotion, but Minato wondered if with Kakashi it was a little more than that. There were other young children here among the families of the war victims. Looking around, Minato could see the different ways they were grieving for their parents. Some of the younger ones just looked confused. The older ones around Kakashi's age understood clearly, and while some were crying, some were trying not to, and others looked like Kushina, as if they'd been crying so hard for so long that they had nothing left. Anyone who looked at Kakashi would be forgiven for thinking he was an incidental observer. If he was a little quiet, that wasn't so different from his usual demeanor. He watched the service with a stiff kind of awareness far from the dumb shock Minato had found him in yesterday. But grief? If Kakashi was grieving, it was impossible to tell. The Hokage read out the names of the lost shinobi and spoke a little about each of them. Minato detected a faint hesitation in the old man's voice before he said the last name. Hatake Tsukumo. A subtle shift came over the gathered crowd. Heads that were lowered came up, shoulders and feet readjusted, and if possible it grew even quieter in that busy square. A greatly trusted friend and exceptional shinobi left us yesterday, the Hokage intoned, his voice carrying easily over the heads of the grievers, filled with those who had sympathized with him, and those who had come to resent him, and those who simply did not know him at all. It's at times like this, when Konoha is facing one of its most grave threats, that we are tested. And there was never a man more tested than Hatake Tsukumo. He has stood with Konoha in its darkest moments and faced insurmountable odds that he not only conquered, but rose above. And never once allowed fear or darkness to change him. To Tsukumo, this village was the people, and the people were his comrades. He fought for them always, and it is to them that he gave his life. The fact that Tsukumo had given his life by taking it was going to be glossed over. This was the kind of discourse that Minato would come to expect. Suicide was too much of a taboo to be spoken of in anything but vague euphemisms, and anyone not aware of what had happened would remain ignorant. That might have been for the best. While some still considered seppuku a dignified answer to a shamed life, plenty more thought it cowardly. Minato himself didn't know what to think, except that he had seen nothing more or less dignified about Tsukumo's death than in any others he had caused or witnessed. If there is one thing that we can learn from his example, concluded the Hokage, it is that we must always stand together, even in the most bitterly divisive of times. If not united, we are nothing. What if that had been Tsukumo's intention? His was a sacrifice that had the power to turn the anger directed at himself back towards the real enemy and mend the rift his mission had caused. Minato could see it in the faces of the ones he'd heard the strongest condemnations from, how their own remorse and guilt troubled them. Kushina called it crocodile tears, but even if these people had gone as far as demand Tsukumo lose his rank, none of them could have wished he lose his life. Perhaps Tsukumo's decision hadn't been totally without meaning or sense. But still, a sane man wouldn't have left the people who loved him like this. Perhaps he would never understand it. Soon the service was over, though it wouldn't be long until the next one, and then the one after that. The body count would rise as the war went on, until the Hokage no longer had the time to preside personally over all the memorial services. Even now he looked tired and harried, and no sooner had he left the podium than masked ANBU agents were coming forward to whisper in his ear. "Something's going on," Kushina muttered, watching. "Who knows," Minato murmured back. With Iwa and Kumo on the move, something was always going on these days. He was more interested in watching the crowd, for while the Hokage was allowed to speed away to more urgent matters, he knew they themselves were going to have a much harder time leaving, especially when it seemed like everyone they knew had decided to converge on them. Mikoto reached them first, giving Kushina a consoling hug before bending to speak to Kakashi. She was good with children, he thought, but Kakashi was remarkably resistant to even the most charming of people, and his responses remained short and terse. If his father were there, Tsukumo would have reprimanded him on his lack of manners. After her came the trio of Inoshikacho. Inoichi, usually nothing but a thorn in Kushina's side, was unusually subdued as he approached with his team and gave his condolences. Kushina accepted his sincerity politely, if a little suspiciously, and as Chuza launched into a fond anecdote of the time Hatake Tsukumo had once saved their team from swamp pythons, Minato felt a warm hand on his shoulder. He turned and looked up to see Jiraiya's sad smile. Funny old world, isn't it? Only spoke to him yesterday, and now he's a picture on the wall of remembrance. It's happening so fast, Minato agreed. Oh, sure. A lot of people are feeling mighty guilty right now, they'll want to bury him fast so they can forget about him sooner. Jiraiya gave a faint snort of derision. It's a lesson to us all, isn't it? The bigger you are, the harder you fall. Minato craned his neck to look up at him. I can see how that would concern someone like you, sensei. Jiraiya looked down at him, and neither smiled. Listen, he began. The Hokages ordered a big push for tomorrow to regain some ground against IWA. We'll be leaving tonight in force. I'll be leading one division, the Hokage wants you to lead another. Tonight? Minato glanced across at Kushina, who was managing to smile weakly as Shikaku poked holes in Chuza's grand anecdotes, and then to Kakashi. The boy was standing off to the side, looking out at pictures on the wall and pretending not to eavesdrop. I suppose it can't be helped. You should go report to the administration offices, Jiraiya said. You'll need the day to prepare. Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on Kakashi and Kushina for you. Minato sighed. Thank you, sensei. With a hefty clap on his shoulder, Jiraiya smiled and wandered over to Kakashi. Before Minato turned away, he heard their exchange. So, what do you like to do for fun, Kakashi-kun? What? Any hobbies? I like reading. Really? I happen to be an author myself, you know. What? Oblivious to the impending corruption of a poor 8-year-old boy, Minato sought out Kushina, touching her arm to draw her attention from the antics the triad. I have to go, he told her discreetly. At once she stiffened and reached out to grasp him. No, she whispered, dread rising in her voice. I have to report to administration. They're sending me out tonight. Now? She pressed a hand to her forehead. But why? You know why. She had seen how far Iwa's incursion into the fire country had gotten. Not even Tsukumo's death could cause her to forget the threat the village was facing. Kushina shook her head. I told you this war was going to separate us again, she said fretfully. And now of all times. I know, I'm sorry. He chucked her cheek and tried on what he hoped was a reassuring smile. I'll see you later, Kushina. She did not look comforted in the slightest. The military-grade equipment was new. Konoha was sparing no expense with the next wave, especially against a force as advanced as IWA was said to be. The green flak vests were out, and in came the steel Manaka-style arm guards and gray carbon fiber tunics. That could deflect most sharp projectiles. The small precision teams couldn't hold against Iwa's superior numbers, so now they were forming teams of 20, led by Jonin, supplemented by medics, communication operators, and saboteur experts. Minato would be taking his division back to the Hayu Valley for the sole purpose of reclaiming it. When they told him the odds of survival, he raised an eyebrow, but was otherwise not too concerned. He'd beaten worse odds before and sent out on suicide missions by people who preferred him not to come back. What bothered him more was the way his set of heavy armor itched against the back of his neck. It was very irritating. At least Kushina approved. He met her on his way back from the administration offices, and she took one look at his new fatigues before she declared, "You're breaking the heart of every girl you walk past wearing that, Minato." Now his neck felt hot with a blush besides being itchy. "Where are you going?" he asked her. I thought you'd be with Kakashi. Jiraiya's with him, she explained. I was just going to the hospital to check on that girl we brought in. Minato had completely forgotten about Anko. Of course, he said quickly. Do you want me to come with you? Since it might have been the last few hours they had together for quite some time, she nodded shyly. I'd like that. They set off for the hospital, the mood muted between them. Although Kushina was doing a magnificent job of keeping up appearances, she was in many ways still reeling. Talking to her was like communicating over a long-distance radio with a time lag. If he asked her a question, it could be a delay of several seconds before she reacted and responded. So you think your seal really worked? He asked her. A long pause. The medic seemed to think so, she said. I'm not sure about its long-term effectiveness. It's a kind of seal that's dependent on the will of the carrier, so how long it lasts is up to her, I guess. That was interesting. Where did you learn this? An even longer pause. Self-taught. It's one of your father's techniques, right? He asked. I thought you said they were sealed inside you. When we were in Whirlpool, I found one of my father's stores under the floorboards. Do you remember the green marble? Vaguely. Some of my father's techniques were sealed inside it, she said. I've been learning bits and pieces ever since, mostly while you were at the border outpost. You never said. Her pause may have been for a different reason this time. I didn't want you to laugh at me. Why would I laugh? I know I'm not very good with studying and stuff. I wanted to be sure I could do it before I told you. You're just so good at everything you do, it's unfair. I wanted this one thing for myself. He understood. She probably wouldn't believe it, but he knew what it felt like to battle with feelings of inferiority. Maybe when I get back you can teach me some of the things you learned, he asked hopefully. And watch you show me up? She shrugged unenthusiastically. Just call me sensei. Then she fell silent, perhaps unwittingly reminding herself of her own sensei. Visiting hours at the hospital were almost over when they arrived, but the nurse on Anko's ward was pleased to see Kushina. I'm so glad you're here, she said. Anko regained consciousness not long after you left yesterday, although she hasn't talked much. Those dreadful police couldn't get a word out of her. Maybe you could try? She won't say what happened to her? Minato asked, following the nurse with Kushina to a private room at the end of the ward. She wouldn't even tell her teacher, the nurse claimed. He came by with the other Sannin, but she clammed up. Remembers you, though. For a while she kept asking where the nice lady with red hair had gone. Kushina tugged Minato's sleeve. Did you hear that? I'm a nice lady. The kid was very sick, he pointed out. She thumped his arm for that, which did nothing but prove his steel-plated sleeve was up to the task. She was still rubbing her knuckles ruefully when they entered Anko's room and found the girl sitting up in her bed. Hello there, Kushina called, sounding about as surprised as Minato felt at the sight of the girl. Yesterday she had looked as if she was near death, and though today she was far from looking like a picture of health, her large black eyes were bright and alert and the blood transfusion plugged into her arm had brought some color back to her cheeks. After what had happened with Tsukumo, this girl was a painfully welcome sight. Do you remember me? Kushina asked uncertainly, approaching the bed. I'm Kushina. I found you yesterday. Anko nodded, her stringy black hair falling in her eyes. Yeah, she said, looking at Kushina curiously. I remember. You were in a bit of state, huh? Dark eyes shifted away uncomfortably and landed on Minato. You're the yellow flash. Minato, said Minato. How are you feeling today, Anka-kan? Kushina asked her. Better, my shoulder hurts though. The nurse moved around the bed. Let me take a look, she said, taking the girl's arm gently and pulling the neck of her hospital gown aside to reveal a square of gauze strapped over her injury. Once it was carefully peeled back, neither Kushina and Minato could resist leaning forward to take a look. The blood was gone and all that remained were 2 puncture marks that were already beginning to scab. However, the 3 tomo marks were stronger than ever, standing out starkly on the girl's white skin and now encircled by a faint ring of intricate script that looked like tiny characters too small to read. "Your seal?" Minato asked her. "It's designed especially for suppressing other curse seals," she said. "It looks like it's holding 2. "I can still feel it," Anko said unhappily, "the weird chakras coming through." Kushina frowned. "My sealing method should completely neutralize marks like that. It must be very strong if you can still feel it." As the nurse applied fresh salve and recovered the mark, Kushina moved to sit on the bed and pulled her feet up. "You'll be okay, Anka-kan. As long as you want my seal to work, it'll keep working. It'll definitely hold until we find the person who did this to you and make them reverse it." Anko looked away again, looking at the patterns in her cotton blanket. She didn't look as if she had much hope left. "Do you remember what happened to you, Anko?" Minato asked her. For a brief second her eyes jumped up to him and then quickly down again. "No." Kushina looked at Minato the same time he looked at her, and the same thought crossed both of their minds. Anko knew exactly what had happened. "Someone hurt you, didn't they?" Kushina guessed. "It's all right, you can tell us." Minato was beginning to doubt this had anything to do with a foreign enemy like Iwa. As young as she was, Anko knew her duty as a shinobi was to report enemy activity if she came across it, and there was no shame in being attacked, unless the one responsible was a little closer to home. "It's very important you tell the nice lady, Anko," chided the nurse. "I can't," snapped the contrary little girl, "or he'll come back and do for me what he did the others." "Who will?" Kushina demanded, almost angry in her indignation on Anko's behalf. "If you tell us we can stop him from hurting you or anyone else." Anko shook her head and drew her legs tight up against her chest. "He's too strong," she mumbled in her knees. "There's no such thing," Kushina told her. "You know who the strongest person in the village is, don't you? He's standing right behind me. There's no one he can't defeat with one arm tied behind his back, and he can protect you against whole armies. He can definitely protect you against one man." Minato shifted his weight uncomfortably and folded his arms. Kushina was overstating his abilities just a touch, and when Anko switched her gaze back to him, she looked equally dubious. "Kakashikin says the yellow flash can beat anyone," she said slowly. "Can you beat Orochimaru-sensei?" His stomach dropped. The arms he'd folded over his chest fell limply back to his sides. "Orochimaru, but why would?" Kushina's eyes widened, their naturally emotive blue muted to glassy green under the harsh hospital lights. "Anko, are you saying Orochimaru did this to you?" she asked with strained calm. Anko looked around at them furtively. After a moment, she nodded. "But he was here," burst out the nurse. "Anko, you mustn't tell such tales about people. Orochimaru was very worried about you, and he's the Hokage's own student." "He wouldn't do this, I'm not a liar," screeched Anko. "He said it would make us stronger, but it hurts so much. The others were making weird noises, so I ran. I woke up here and he was smiling and he said he wasn't going to teach me anymore and if I told anyone he would kill me." By the time she'd finished she could barely breathe as huge, gasping sobs shook her little frame. Kushina was the first to recover from her shock, and quickly pulled the girl into her arms. She was speechless. Minato could see tears of sympathy already welling in her eyes. She said there were others. Minato said, feeling a disconnect between the racing of his heart and his crawlingly slow brain. Kushina whispered something to Anko who returned a gargled, halting response into her chest. "Other children," Kushina gave her stricken translation. "Minato, she says he took them from other villages." But there had been no other reports of children being found in a similar condition to Anko. She was the only one who escaped, he said numbly, realizing it as he said it. Unable to stop himself, he turned at once and headed for the door. "What are you going to do?" Kushina demanded. "You should go to the Hokage, tell him everything," Minato ordered. "And tell him to send backup to Orochimaru's lab." "You're not going to face Orochimaru," she said fiercely, covering Anko's ears. "I know what I said, but I don't like your chances against someone like him. Not on your own." He paused in the doorway. "He's the one we were looking for all along, Kushina," he said shortly. "Taking people, children, from other villages to experiment on them, it's him. He was right under our noses this whole time, and if his victims are still alive, I'm not going to waste another second. I won't face him if I don't have to, but I have to find the others. So please just do as I say." Minato didn't give her time to respond. He was already out the door and running down the corridor, jostling anyone aside who happened to get in his way. The sun was beginning to set as he burst out onto the street. Blissfully ignorant pedestrians on their way home glanced after him curiously as he streaked by, and when he turned down an alley only to find his way blocked by a shopkeeper unloading his crates of goods, he heard the man's exclamation of shock as Minato bolted up the wall and onto the roof. Orochimaru's lab wasn't far from the hospital, but his speed surprised even Minato himself. Nervous onlookers watched as the young man careened to a halt outside the lab's door, tested the handle once, and then proceeded to throw his weight against the door with violent thuds. Minato didn't care who saw, or if Orochimaru was inside, or if every alarm in Konoha went off for such blatant vandalism. One precise kick with his foot and the lock smashed open, spraying the floor inside with splinters of wood. Minato forced his way inside. The lab had always struck his as creepy and dangerous in the sense that anything he touched might be a flesh-eating virus or otherwise booby-trapped to hell. Now Minato was beginning to appreciate just how sick this place was. He strode through the main lab without hesitation now, no longer troubled by the sight of partially dissected animals or other foul experiments. If Anko was right, these experiments paled in comparison to the others Orochimaru was hiding. As he passed the workbench where all of Orochimaru's paperwork lay in cluttered piles, he was brought to a halt by a twinge of a memory. It forced him to reach out and grab one of Orochimaru's journals, regardless of how many protections and tricks the Sannin had set up to detect disturbances. He flipped the book open to a page, any page, and fixed upon the first sentence that leapt out at him. Cuttings from specimens 5 through 8 withering. Nitrogen content of soil depleted. Written by hand with a simple ballpoint pen. Slanted characters, but neat. Feminine, as Kushina had described it, whereas Minato had called it psychopathic. It was exactly the same handwriting as the message he had found in Senju Han's vault. The book dropped from Minato's hands and clattered on the floor, forgotten. He was already turning, hurrying for the room where all Orochimaru's regimented little samples of blood were kept. He did not spare even a moment to check for his mother's vial. If he had, he might have noticed right then that his vial was missing. Minato's attention was only for the heavy iron door at the end of the room. The last time he'd been here the sounds coming from behind it had raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He'd been so close to opening it, but Orochimaru had brushed him off with an explanation that they were merely animals. Maybe that was the truth, or at least how Orochimaru saw them. A man who experimented on people as casually as he did other creatures couldn't possibly see them as anything more than a lower order of life. There were no noises now. The lab was utterly still. If there were people behind this door, children even, were they still alive? He would be in plenty of trouble if he burst through this door and found Orochimaru presiding over some innocuous tests with rats and mice. He'd be in even more trouble if he burst through and found exactly what he feared he would find, especially if Orochimaru was indeed on the other side. Kushina wasn't being overly concerned when she had warned him against facing the Sannin. Minato didn't know much of his abilities, but he was widely regarded as being the strongest of the Sannin and could rival the Hokage himself. But Minato could hesitate no longer. If he was wrong, he would deal with the consequences later. For now he couldn't risk any more delays if there really were children being held inside. Resolved, he seized the door's stiff lever and pulled. It was no surprise to him that it didn't budge, but then he had ways around it, and unlike with Han's vault, he was in no mood for the discreet approach. Pulling back his hand, he summoned his chakra in a tight vortex in the center of his palm. He waited for it to grow and gain momentum, until its blue glow illuminated the pristine white walls of the blood room. With an charged shout he smashed his hand into the door, Rasengan and all, and felt the metal twist and cave beneath its force like old rice paper. His arm plunged through the hole, and cool air washed over his hand. He was through. Even if this was the limit of how much he could forcefully penetrate, it was enough. Sliding his elbow around, he had leverage to touch his fingers to the other side of the thick metal door. That was where he planted the chakra tag. He only had to activate Hiration to find himself standing at once on the other side upon a stone staircase. Poorly lit strings of ancient electric lights spanned the low ceiling, all the way to the bottom of its steep descent where he saw a trembling black reflection. Water. Was this a direct access to the sewer system? Minato kept his hand to the wall as he followed the stairs down and stepped out onto the shallow channel of water with his chakra-charged sandals. Probing the stone told him nothing. It seemed that like the vault at the Fire Temple, there was a whole complex down here that was hidden from such detection methods. He doubted even the Intelligence Division, who could monitor every inch of Konoha with their meticulous detection and barrier methods, could see this place. It was off the grid entirely, and Minato felt half-blind as he followed the narrow tunnel's only course until the stairwell was lost behind him around dozens of corners and curves. This place was not without its traps either. When Minato triggered the first, he was glad for his new armor. The storm of kunai flew at him as if from nowhere, and though he was fast enough to avoid most, a few still glanced off his steel-plated sleeves, too close for Minato's comfort. He watched his step more carefully after that. Orochimaru clearly had something to hide down here to employ such antisocial tactics. When a door appeared before him, Minato paused. He wondered if this was another trap of some kind, for though he had to be nearing his goal, it all seemed a little too easy. Orochimaru was a Sannin. Surely he had tougher methods of keeping people away from his insidious activities than a few spring-loaded kunai? This man was a master of ninjutsu, and genjutsu particularly. If he wanted to keep people away, he must have had a plethora of stronger methods than that. Unless the traps were disarmed, because Orochimaru was here? There was only one way to find out. Minato advanced on the door, tension vibrating through every tendon and muscle. It has to be a trap, he told himself as he touched the handle and felt it turn obediently for him. It has to be. He wished it was. The first thing that assaulted him was the stink. It caught him off guard and made his breath catch in his throat. He knew the rancid stench of death and decaying human flesh far too well. During the last war he'd found himself downwind of plenty of corpses on the battlefield, and nothing could ever make him forget the day he had infiltrated a certain mist outpost and walked into a hut where the enemy Nin stored their slaughtered enemies for dissection and desecration. A human abattoir. Minato had never wanted to see or smell anything like that for the rest of his life. And yet here he was. It was happening all over again in his own beloved Konoha. Minato froze in the doorway, staring inside at the bodies hanging from the walls, at the men and women strung up like the carcasses of pigs in a butcher shop. Their blood, old and black, stained the walls and the floor, tracing the path where it had once flowed fresh into the grates on the floor. More bodies lay on tables, some whole, some in pieces, while cages cluttered one end of the room, large enough to hold dogs, or children. Now they were empty. Unconsciously, he had entered the room. He didn't realize it until his foot knocked against a plastic box and he looked down sharply. A collection of severed legs protruded from it absurdly, waste discarded as casually as Minato discarded junk mail. Another bin further away held arms. Minato caught sight of a slim hand with manicured nails, a woman's. A movement in the middle of the room made him flinch. He had never been a jumpy individual, but when the man on the table nearest to him twitched, his own heart nearly stopped. He had to rally his nerves with effort and calm his racing pulse. Here at least was one survivor. As wretched and terrifying as this place was, and Minato didn't think this was even the only room down here, he had to keep his calm if he was going to help. Reaching the table, Minato clasped the man's shoulder to shake it. He was naked and deeply discolored, especially around the fresh stitches running the length of his chest. Bolted restraints pinned his ankles and wrists to the metal table, and another held him by the neck. "Wake up," Minato said, his voice barely breaking above a whisper. "Wake up, we need to get out of here." The man's eyes slid open, but there was no sense in them. "You're going to be all right," Minato promised, tearing at the restraints holding him down. "I'm going to get you out of here." The man's cracked lips parted. "Help me," he croaked. Minato recognized the accent. This was a Sunanin. "I can help you," he said. "Can you stand?" "No." The man's head rolled in a faint shake. "No, help me, die." Those rasped words made Minato's hands pause in their task of freeing the restraints. He stared at the man, into bleak, empty eyes that reminded him far too much of Tsukumo's. "Don't give up," he pleaded. "Kill me. I beg you." A strange feeling flooded Minato's veins then. It washed through him, cold and prickling and leaving behind an unpleasantly numb sensation throughout his body. This place was making him sick, he thought. Whatever the man said, Minato had to free him and get him out of there. The restraints had to be undone. But Minato couldn't seem to make his hands obey. He wanted to look down at them, to figure out why he could hardly feel them and why they wouldn't respond to his desire to move. Not even his eyes would respond. "I was beginning to think you would never come." The sound of Orochimaru's voice cut through him like glass, but however much his mind screamed at him to turn and fight, or just to run, he remained immobile. Even his heart that had been galloping in his chest only moments ago had now begun to slow, as if it could not perceive the danger he was in. The connection between mind and body had been cut. Silently, the Sannin slid into his view. His almost ghostly form circled the table to stand opposite him, where he lowered his head until they were eye to eye. "Perfect," Orochimaru said with his silkiest smile, observing the passive state of his new victim. "I've been waiting for you, Minato-kun." "Minato-kun, I have to say this is an improvement. A vast improvement indeed." Orochimaru chuckled to himself as he waved long, white fingers before Minato's face to test his reaction, and gained none. For all appearances, the young jonin had frozen in place, unaware of Orochimaru and the room around him, as if time had stopped. The man he had been attempting to release was still barely conscious, though he shakily reached out with his freed arm to grope at Minato's unflinching one. "Help me." A wide leer of amusement split Orochimaru's face as he peered down at his pathetic prisoner. "What are you asking him for? He can no more help you now than any one of these useless corpses," he said, spreading his arms wide to present the various bodies suspended against the walls. "But matters are now drawing to a close and I believe I have reached the limits of my research here. I will have to move, and you have served your purpose." Blood spurted outwards in one swift downward stroke. The Sunanin gasped in a mixture of relief and suffering and rolled his head. Though his eyes never closed, the moment life fled them was unmistakable, like watching lights being extinguished in darkness, something Minato had grown used to seeing, but never quite like this. The blood spatter dripped down his face, he could feel its warmth and thickness but he couldn't wipe it away. He couldn't react. His body was paralyzed, severed from his control as brutally as the limbs had been severed from these cadavers. A claustrophobic feeling set in. He was trapped inside his own body, nothing but a pair of eyes helpless to watch Orochimaru sedately wiping his kunai clean on his sleeve. Sliding his weapon back out of sight in his belt, Orochimaru gracefully tucked a sheet of inky black hair behind an ear. Never once did his smile slip throughout the brutal execution. Now where were we? Oh, that's right. Since you're here, perhaps you can assist me? Follow me, Minato-kun. Like hell, thought Minato. But his body was already moving, pushing away from the table in a faintly lumbering fashion, and following Orochimaru's form through to another room. With the Sannin's back turned, now would be a prime time to strike and kill. No one who saw this lair would blame him. Minato tried with all his might to draw his hand up, to reach for one of his weapons, but all he detected was a faint tremor in his fingers before his will subsided. Don't resist, Minato-kun, Orochimaru said softly without turning to him. Minato wouldn't put it past him to literally have eyes on the back of his head. I control your very blood from your arteries to your capillaries. If you resist too strongly, you will snap your own blood vessels or tear your heart to pieces. Please be mindful. What had this bastard done? There was a furnace in the room he was brought to. It burned steadily in the corner, filling the air with a hot, acrid smell. Though Minato couldn't willfully direct his gaze toward it, out of the corner of his eye he saw more buckets of limbs and lumpy body bags too small to be adults. Was this what happened the rest of the children? Sit. Orochimaru pointed at a solitary chair against the wall. Minato sat, inwardly raging at the unquestioning obedience he'd been forced into. You'll have noticed this is no ordinary paralysis, the Sannin said, removing a scroll from his vest. Believe me, I think this is some of my finest work, Minato-kun. I've had a lot of time to prepare this. He unraveling the scroll with almost loving care, and turned it for Minato to see. A jutsu, clearly, and it almost looked like a summoning contract, except it was entirely written in blood. Yes, that's your blood. It's been most useful to me, Orochimaru told him, almost like a friendly physician to a patient if this was not a slaughterhouse. He couldn't have been more at this man's mercy if he'd been the one naked and tied to that table. Surely Minato-kun, you know the power of blood in our profession. You really should think twice before giving it so freely, even to such trustworthy men such as myself. You have only yourself to blame. Did you really believe I had any interest in your miserable ancestry? How had he ever believed anything Orochimaru had ever told him? It had been so easy to dismiss him as an eccentric, or even just a little bit of a creep. Impossible to think that his sensei's own teammate and a student of the Hokage himself could be capable of such depravity. Yet here, surrounded by the grisly evidence, Orochimaru's eerie smile finally made sense. This insanity had a context. One-sided conversations are so dull, don't you think, said the Sannin, running his finger across the scroll's tapestry of blood scripts. I think we can afford to loosen a few binds at least. Genius must be acknowledged after all. Minato's tongue was suddenly his own again. His eyes darted around the room, under his control again, as he took several greedy breaths like a man submerged for too long. Whatever relief he felt was tempered and the rest of him remained frustratingly numb to his commands. Snapping. A furious glare on Orochimaru, he barked, "What have you done to me? You were proving yourself to be too much of a wild card and I dislike opponents whose moves I cannot anticipate," shrugged Orochimaru, "much better to have you close at hand, more so to have you under my control. You'll pay for this. If all you're going to do is shout tedious clichés at me, I'm afraid I'll have to return you to your previous state. Where are the children?" Orochimaru stared at him, blank with apparent annoyance. "Which children? Like Anko. What did you do with them? That particular batch?" The Sannin tilted his head, gaze sliding towards the furnace. The bottom of Minato's stomach dropped. He had prayed his suspicions were wrong, but now his blood was reaching far past boiling point. "You're sick." Minato spat. "Once the Hokage finds out about this, you're dead?" "Hardly. The Hokage may once have been a god of shinobi, but these days he's nothing more than an ineffective old man, clearly, since he decided you should be his successor. His ineptitude is illustrated thus. He even knows what I am now, but he is still working up the courage to face me. Which is why we must move quickly, my dear Minato-kun. Time is short." Even so, there was nothing hurried about the Sanin's movement as he went about the room, gathering instruments and scrolls from shelves and cupboards. "You don't know how much it has pleased me that you arrived in time." "I'm not interested in your schedule," Minato hissed. "You should be. My plans involve you now, of course." "For what?" he demanded sharply. "For what, he says." Orochimaru shook his head and chidingly clucked his tongue. "You've been a thorn in my side, but you're more use to me alive than dead. Look at yourself. To kill you would be a terrible waste. You've made quite the name for yourself for someone without a clan or a bloodline jutsu, and you've not yet reached your prime even. There was a time when I considered taking you and laying you out on one of my tables to cut through your perfect skin to learn your secrets, but it's your jutsu I want, and no amount of sifting through your blood and bone will tell me how it works." "I'll tell you how it works," Minato said evenly. Orochimaru cocked a thin eyebrow. "Oh? Come closer, and I'll whisper it." Then he'd tear his bloody throat out with his teeth if he had to. With a faint snort, the Sannin turned away. "Your cooperation is unnecessary. With this jutsu, you're my puppet, I can control your whole body. I can make you do anything I like, regardless of your will. Would you like a demonstration? Waste as much time as you like. The Hokage's probably on his way right now. Minato-kun. Break one of your fingers for me." His arms were already moving before he had even comprehended the order. The fingers of his right hand wrapped around the ring finger of his left and began to bend it backward, inexorably. "Wait," Minato muttered, fighting for control. The queer feeling that he was watching someone else's limbs moving was shot through with the very real pain that accompanied it. Tendons and ligaments strained. The stretched skin on his palm turned white. He gritted his teeth and held his breath, aware that at any second the bone would snap. Orochimaru devoured the tension etched in his face greedily, reveling in it. Until he suddenly held up his hand. "Stop." Minato's hands dropped back onto his lap anticlimactically. His finger throbbed angrily, but at least it wasn't broken. "I think I've proved my point," said Orochimaru. "No need to go overboard. Who acquires a perfect weapon and then blunts it before they can use it? And what would you use me for?" Minato asked him quietly, dreading the answer. A further thrill of revulsion rattled his spine as the older man stepped forward and slid a cold fingertip down Minato's cheek. "The possibilities are endless," he said in his silkiest murmur. "You really would make the perfect weapon, but I'm afraid this jutsu can't be sustained indefinitely, and to use you as a weapon would imply I want to wield you. Rather, I would possess you, mind and body." "I'd rather you kill me now," Minato responded tightly. Orochimaru sneered at the disgust Minato was unable to hide. "It's a natural progression, you understand. I possess your body right now, but to truly learn your secrets and acquire them for myself, I must possess your mind. I must become you." "What?" The man had to be insane. This sounded more like rambling nonsense to Minato than genius. "This body of mine has peaked and will weaken eventually. Its decline has already begun. It has reached its limits and my mind deserves a better host. It deserves youth and vitality and a body that can realize my potential. And your body is wasted on such a dull, uncomprehending mind. Why not donate it to a greater cause? For science." "Science fiction," Minato spluttered. You're talking about switching bodies? That's not possible. Was it not also impossible to bring the dead back to life? Yet the Nidaime Hokage proved the world wrong. Dear Minato-kun, everything was once impossible before some great pioneer made it possible. You think you're a pioneer? Minato jerked his chin around the room, inviting the Sannin to look around. You've engineered nothing but meaningless slaughter and invited international war. You think people are going to remember you as a pioneering genius? No one's going to remember you as anything but a pasty, mass-murdering psychopath who had to be put down, and good riddance. Orochimaru was unperturbed. He flicked his hair over his shoulder again and slid a finger over his lips thoughtfully. I don't care about leaving a legacy since I don't plan on leaving. With this technique I am creating, I will always be here. Immortality is finally within my grasp, Minato-kun. You should be honored that I have chosen you to be my first. Minato felt he did a good job preventing himself from screaming enough vile expletives to make even Kushina blush. Swallowing hard to temper himself, he responded with a cool, I disagree. And I have no further desire to humor you. While I hold your blood, you don't have the luxury of choice. Orochimaru said, and the moment he touched the contract scroll, Minato's minuscule freedom of movement fled. His face went lax and his gaze locked in its previous dead stare. He could have screamed for the frustration that built inside him with no possible outlet. He would break free of this, he told himself. Once he figured out a way, Orochimaru wouldn't know what had hit him. Minato had to take him down, not just for the safety of others, but because this man deserved it. He'd never felt that way towards anyone before. Minato may have killed more people than he cared to count, but he had never contemplated murder before, premeditated and with extreme prejudice. The Sannin wound the scroll shut again with sharp, elegant movements of his hands before tucking it into the pouch on his hip. There, he said, looking back at Minato. You really are a much more pleasant sight when your face isn't twisted with such hideous emotions. Quite beautiful, in fact. I certainly won't mind having that face as my own. He leaned in close. Oh, that's if you survive the curse seal, of course. Orochimaru was so close, Minato could have said he felt his body heat. But Orochimaru wasn't that different than the corpses he surrounded himself with, and when the Sannin laid his hands on Minato's skin, they were so cold they felt like they sapped not only his heat but his life. To realize your full potential, Orochimaru said, tilting Minato's head back to expose his throat, is a great gift. The seal will help you do that. There's a 9 in 10 chance that you'll die, but if that's the case, you would be useless to me anyway. And maybe your odds will be a little better? Like dear Ankakan, there's a petulant fire in you that demands survival. As the Sannin smiled, Minato could have sworn 2 of his teeth were elongating. But it wasn't a vampire that he was reminded of, it was a snake. A venomous snake closing in on its paralyzed victim to deliver the final bite. After you receive this venom, you will sleep deeply, Orochimaru went on softly, almost reassuringly if not for the fact that he was bent over Minato with his lips close enough to brush his throat. If you wake up, you will be mine. A 90% chance of death. Minato wasn't sure he disliked those odds, not when survival meant more of this. He would rather die than become a tool for Orochimaru to further his barbaric experiments. He was more infuriated that he would be denied a last opportunity to spit in this monster's eyes before those fangs sunk into his throat and did to him what he had done to Anko and the other children he'd used as disposable test subjects. No. Minato wouldn't die. He refused to. Not until he got his chance at ending this demon. Orochimaru's breath rolled across his skin. Minato may not have been to move, but every hair on his body rose and tingled in anticipation of the first prick of those teeth. His heart may have been slow, but its beat rang loud in his ears, almost as if the dull thumping noise filled the whole room. It took him a moment to realize it wasn't his heart. With a faint hiss of impatience, Orochimaru swung away from him and stood still as the noise faded to silence once more. It appears someone has broken through my first defense. What uninvited guest is this? He looked at Minato, considering him. Did you call for backup after all? Perhaps you're not as stupid as you seem. He whirled back to the equipment he'd gathered, and fetched down another scroll from his collection. This one was less like a document and more like a log. When Orochimaru unraveled it, it took up most of the floor. I can't allow the Cretans of this village to get their hands on my experiments and data, he said, arranging his provisions over the scroll. Most of my necessary supplies are already sealed in this scroll, sadly I won't have time to transport the rest. And the subjects? Well, the ones still alive won't last much longer anyway. I don't suppose it matters now. Forming his hands into seals, a flash filled the room. Unable to blink voluntarily or shield his eyes, the light made strange bright spots dance on Minato's retina, though when they cleared he could see Orochimaru sealing the scroll tightly with a red rope. All his provisions were now locked inside it. You will take this, he said to Minato. Stand. With the rest of the rope, he tied the scroll onto Minato's back. He was being turned into a mule, he thought indignantly. And Orochimaru didn't pack light. There might have been a whole laboratory sealed inside this scroll for how much it weighed. Minato's body didn't complain. It adjusted its posture to take the extra weight like he was nothing more than a beast of burden. Take this scroll and meet me by the Valley of the End. Konoha trusts you so no one will stop you, although if they try, you are to dispose of them by any means necessary. And do be careful. That scroll is worth more than your life, and if you at any point attempt to break free of my control, remember my warning and imagine what it must feel like for every blood vessel in your body to burst at once. Chuckling darkly, Orochimaru approached a naked section of wall and stroked his fingers across it like a lover. Cracks appeared in the solid concrete, revealing a stone door. The Sannin pushed it back, exposing the pitch-black passage behind it. You will take this path. Now go. Minato's curses were silent, but no less heartfelt as he dashed into the hidden tunnel. Orochimaru sealed the entrance shut behind him, throwing him into darkness. Though he couldn't see, he could hear his feet slapping rapidly against the puddles of condensation as he sped through the narrow passage, wondering where it was leading him and if he was going to crash into a wall. He had to stop himself somehow. He couldn't remain a mute passenger while he was forced to assist such a heinous lunatic. He had to get his body back under control. If he remained calm and didn't panic, and ignored how disorientating it was to run and not even be in control, he could concentrate on the problem. Rather than try and bring himself to a standing stop, he had to win back his body in more subtle ways. The tunnel began to slope upwards and with it an ambient haze of light removed the shadows obscuring his path. Beneath his feet, the texture of the ground grew rougher as the walls lost their regular shape and began to slope. This was less of a man-made structure and becoming something more natural. His body slowed as the tunnel grew tighter. His flight was coming to a stop at the end of the path, though it was not another door he found, but a smoother gap between solid rocks. Moonlight poured through it like silver water. Without hesitation, Minato's body forced himself and the scroll through the tight squeeze and stepped out into a dark forest. Where was he? His treacherous body paused, as if pondering the same question, looking around to take stock of his surroundings before turning his eyes to look up at the night sky through the tops of the trees. The faint, orange glow behind him indicated Konoha lay in that direction, its light pollution always a giveaway at such close range. Then his gaze traced the stars, locating the constellations, and following the line of the Dipper to the North Star that shone like a bright beacon directly ahead. That way would lie the Valley of the End, he realized, for though he'd never been there he knew the gorge was around 100 miles directly north of Konoha. As if his body had been listening in on his thoughts, it suddenly began to move again, setting off at a run through the trees in a direct line for the Northern Star. It must have been taking cues from his subconscious. A body could operate on its own to some degree, it could walk and breath take simple commands, all learned behaviors that were embedded deeper than the conscious mind. But navigating the stars? He could only have unwittingly told himself where to go. Was it possible to turn off his own mind in this situation? Would that even help or make things worse? It was when he was vaulting over a fallen tree that something flashed in the corner of his eye. The moonlight reflecting off a leaf? Or a blade? His head turned to catch a whisper of movement through the trees beside him, before two kunai split the air inches from his nose. Warning shots. Oh hell, he thought, as his body slowed to a stop of its own accord. Identify yourself. He was already surrounded. Shadows with white masks descended from the trees, faceless ANBU charged with protecting Konoha while so many ninja were being deployed to the border. There was at least one Jonin here. Unfortunately, he was also the only other person beside Orochimaru that Minato, in his darkest hours, might have considered giving a deserved kick to the face. Minato? Ren called to him. What are you doing here? Orochimaru's jutsu was not so complicated that it could force him to speak or lie. In response to Ren's question, Minato simply stared. Just walk away, he begged silently. His own body had become a strange, unpredictable thing he couldn't trust. It had only one charge, to get to the valley and make sure no one got in his way. And here was Ren, proving once again that he existed purely to get in Minato's way. Except this time there was a little more at stake than just Kushina's heart. Faced with such steadfast vacancy, Ren began to frown. Last I checked your division was waiting for you at the gates. What are you doing out here alone, Minato? There was no way to warn him that he was not looking at Minato, but something far more like a wild animal. Why isn't he answering? Asked one of the ANBU outside his line of sight. What's wrong with his eyes? Something was wrong with his eyes? Ren looked troubled. They're red, aren't they? I'm not imagining that. They were red? A beat passed before one ANBU began to heft the pole he carried into an offensive stance. It's not the yellow flash. It's a trick. It's definitely Namikaze Minato, said an elder Hyuga. Ren's hands hovered close to the kunai lining his belt. He must be under a genjutsu. No genjutsu, confirmed the Hyuga. His chakra is not in flux. Then what the hell is his problem? And just as Minato had dreaded, his body shot forward like a coiled spring, so fast the rest of them may have been moving in slow motion. He saw the surprise register on Ren's face as he reached out to seize the other Jonin by the vest, about to pull him forward and down onto the kunai Minato was thrusting up. Kushina was never going to forgive him for this. But his kunai never found its mark. Inches before it could sink into Ren's belly, Minato pulled back sharply to avoid the metal-tipped pole that plunged between them. The ANBU had interfered. Ren surged back to a safe distance and Minato's gaze locked onto his new opponent, unable to stop himself automatically judging the range of his long weapon and the strength of its wielder as his body shifted tactics accordingly. The ANBU spun the staff masterfully, advancing on Minato and forcing him backwards, always just one step outside the striking distance. Emboldened by his retreat, the ANBU lurched forward with a violent shout, aiming fast for his chest, but Minato's deft half-step and pivot caused the sharpened staff to slide harmlessly through the air past his ribs. He slammed his arm down, effectively trapping it to his side and tearing it from his opponent's hands. The staff flashed in a hard circle, cracking the ANBU around the face and knocking the mask clean off his face. Minato didn't get to see how badly the man fell, he had already turned and swept the feet out from beneath the ninja trying to sneak up behind him. A gap had presented itself in the circle around him, a chance to escape. So go! He screamed at himself. If this confrontation went on, someone would be killed, and once that happened there would be no going back. His own comrades and colleagues held back, uncertain what to do with him while they waited for his next move. Minato could have cheered with relief when his own arm tossed aside the staff and charged through the gap left by Ren. "Stop him!" Anbu shouted in his wake. "No!" Ren's order rung out clearly. "Let him go, inform the Hokage we have another rogue." Anything else they said, Minato was soon too far out of earshot to hear. And while his body moved swiftly through the forest without any apparent concern, Minato withdrew into himself, barely aware of the trees that flashed past between snatches of moonlight. He was distinctly and uncomfortable reminded of what had happened the last time the abductor had used one of his own victims as a decoy. How clever Orochimaru had been, casting a jutsu on that poor Chunin, Kushina, to make him act suspiciously, and then to send Minato to hunt him down like a rat. Looking back, Minato wondered how he could ever have mistaken Orochimaru's deception as incompetence, and how he had failed to see the truth because it had been easier to think the greatest Sannin was a crappy detective rather than an evil genius. He hadn't been the only one to miss the truth, but his current predicament made it all the more galling. Was what happened to Kushina going to happen all over again, only this time with Minato mistaken as a conspirator? Surely even Ren knew him well enough to know he couldn't really be a rogue. Even if this was a jutsu none of them had seen before, they would at least understand he was not in control of himself, right? Once they found out the pristine Sannin was a mass murderer, maybe it wouldn't be that hard to believe the pristine yellow flash could be in on it too. Minato realized he was beginning to panic, despite himself. It took a lot for him to lose his cool, though maybe being suspended inside his own mind with the uncanny feeling of treading air in empty space was enough to shake his level-headed nature. This kind of foul trick was alien to him. He wasn't sure how to cope when connection to the outside world had been cut. If you lost the sense of your body, losing your sense of self couldn't be far behind. And almost to prove the growing disconnect between the two, the next time Minato noticed where he was, he realized he had reached the Valley of the End. When had he arrived? How long had he been running without pause? His body was cold and fatigued, but the sensations were far away and muffled to Minato's awareness. He stood on the precipice above the gigantic carving of the Shodai Hokage, looking down at the churning waterfall. A spectacular sight even without the benefit of daylight to illuminate the full gorge. The moonlight cast impenetrably black shadows, giving the impression that the cavernous rips in the land went on forever. He'd only seen it once before as a genin with Jiraiya and his team. It looked quite different now that the eyes taking it in barely felt like his own anymore. Upon the Shodai's head, Minato's body finally sank to sit on the bare, lichen-scarred rock. The scroll was loosened from its place on his back and set down beside him. He was settling down to wait, it seemed, head down but facing the tree line to the south. If anyone appeared, he would know about it. For now he knew he was alone. The waterfall behind him was like white noise, almost drowning out the subtler sounds of nighttime, an own keening for a partner in the forest, the crickets chirping in the grass, and the wind that whistled through the cracks and edges of the rocky valley. On an ordinary night, this would be peaceful. At the very least, it gave Minato an opportunity to fully focus on himself. With his head tilted down he could see his hands curled loosely on his lap, familiar yet foreign. He normally didn't have to think about moving them, so how did he fight for control? Repeating commands in his head didn't work, and though he could grasp the faint sensations he still received that let him know his fingers were cold, trying to expand his sense was like fighting against a wall of concrete. Orochimaru had allowed very little give in his contractual jutsu. All Minato could manage in the end was to make two fingers twitch straight for a brief moment. His reward was a sting of pain, and then the sight of blood blooming beneath the skin, steadily turning the fingers darker and darker until they were a florid purple by the time the sky started to lighten in prelude to sunrise. Orochimaru hadn't been joking. Resisting the jutsu really would snap his blood vessels. A few bruises on his fingers was just a small taste of a technique that could make him bleed to death without breaking his skin. By the time the sun began creeping over the eastern mountains, Minato was short on hope. He still couldn't move. If Orochimaru had been defeated by whoever had been breaking into the lab behind him, Minato would have been freed by now. It was really no surprise to him when a dawn shadow broke away from the trees to approach him. Stiffly, Minato's chin lifted at last and he looked up at Orochimaru. "All is set, Minato-kun," he said. "Most of Konoha is now following 100 false leads. We may proceed at leisure to our destination. Stand." The cold had set in more deeply than Minato could feel. He was slow to rise and straighten, and the moment he was on his feet, Orochimaru snatched up his hand. "What is this?" he demanded, holding up Minato's bruised and swollen fingers. If someone could mingle amusement with dismay, he did so then. "Trying to push your luck? You must take better care of yourself, Minato-kun. That's my future body you've damaged with your carelessness." Fortunately, the young heal so fast. To punctuate this, Orochimaru caressed his bony fingers over Minato's cheek. For the first time in his life, Minato thought a ruptured aorta couldn't strike him down fast enough. "Get your stinking hands off him, you snake-faced freak." A chill squeezed around Minato's heart. Of all the people to have come to his rescue. Not her, please not her. Orochimaru ceased the violation of Minato's cheek and dropped his hand. He looked off towards the trees at a figure that remained outside of Minato's narrow range of vision. Not much amusement was playing on his face anymore. In fact, the Sannin suddenly appeared wary, an expression Minato was not used to seeing on him. "And just how did you manage to trace me, Uzumaki?" he demanded. "You? Who gives a damn about you? I'm here for him." Kushina was always so brave and passionate, especially when she had no right to be. Right now her voice rang out clearly above the waterfall, never wavering once despite facing down the most dangerous man in Konoha. "Please go away." Minato begged her silently. "Please just go." Orochimaru tilted his head to flick an unreadable glance at Minato. "I'm afraid I already have plans for him. Run along and find yourself a new lover. I'm not leaving here without him." Kushina shouted. Footfalls scraped against rock. It sounded like she was running towards them. Orochimaru grabbed the front of Minato's armored vest, moving so fast that Minato didn't realize what was happening until he became aware that his feet were no longer touching the ground. His eyes stared dead ahead, straight towards Kushina, who had stopped in her tracks as if she didn't dare move. Her horror was understandable. Minato was being dangled over the edge of an abyss, held up only by Orochimaru's grip on his clothes. The Sannin was far stronger than his slender body suggested. "Minato's not leaving with you. He either comes with me or he dies. You don't want to force my hand now, do you? What's wrong with his eyes? What have you done to him?" "Nothing I can't undo. But if you take one step closer to me, child, I will be forced to let go. How pretty will he look when his brains are splattered across the rocks below?" Kushina scoffed uncomfortably. "You're underestimating how thick Minato's skull is if you think a fall like that could make a dent in it." Probably true, but it wasn't a theory Minato was eager to see tested out. The long drop beneath him to the rocky base of the waterfall was a little concerning, however right then he was more worried about what was going to happen to Kushina. Someone like Orochimaru could strike her dead in an instant. So why was he bothering to threaten Minato's life to keep her away? "Walk away now, girl," Orochimaru intoned steadily. "There's nothing more you can do for him." Kushina's fists clenched tightly at her sides. Of course she wasn't going to give up that easily. "What do you want with him?" she demanded. "Nothing that concerns you. Then leave him and take me instead." "Oh, now that is tempting." Orochimaru stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Very tempting. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought of taking you before. One could learn a lot from someone like you, and I would have spent many merry years dissecting you and your secrets if you hadn't been under the infernal protection of the Hokage and that pathetic sensei of yours. Well, they're no longer a problem for me, it seems, but I no longer have any use for you. Yours is not a power I desire. Namikaze Minato, however, will accommodate my needs just perfectly. Kushina's stare was stony, afraid, but drawing on that fear to sustain her courage. I won't let you take him, she ground out, I won't lose anyone else. Then you have only yourself to blame. Orochimaru deadpanned. He jerked Minato back onto the safety of solid ground and released him, before nodding his chin towards Kushina. Kill her. What? What? Kushina stepped back as Minato's body was compelled to step forward. If you want him, you'll have to fight for him, said Orochimaru. Are you willing to go all out against your own lover, little monster? Minato's hand was already sliding his kunai free, ready to exact his orders. The shock and denial paralyzing his soul was mirrored back in Kushina's face, and though she should have been running, she maintained her ground. Minato, she called to him cautiously, you know me. Come on. Get a hold of yourself. Run away, he pleaded with her. He wasn't worth this. There was no way he could hold himself back against her, and no way was Kushina strong enough to match him. If she had sense she would forget about him and leave. But instead she was reaching for her own kunai. I know you're still in there, she shouted. I know you can fight it. You're strong. He's strong, Orochimaru agreed. But the strongest are always the most vulnerable to attacks that come from within. You can't reason with him, so don't try. Accept your fate. You'll be accepting my boot up your ass later, you freak of fucking nature, Kushina muttered beneath her breath, eyes trained intently on Minato only. She really was going to try and fight him. She had to be suicidal. Minato's steps paused, gaze flicking over her stance and picking out at least 3 weaknesses. He was going to kill her, and he was powerless to stop himself. His body rocketed forward without warning, closing the distance between them in barely a fraction of a moment. Kushina's desperate face was all he could see as he feinted left, spun, and struck out at her from the right. His kunai connected against hers with a hair-raising shriek of metal on metal, and the force of the blow was enough to send Kushina recoiling. She staggered and recovered, enough to deflect his kick, but not the one that followed rapidly after it, knocking the kunai straight out of her hand. Kushina inhaled sharply, either in pain or in fury. She ducked beneath his next blow and nimbly bound out of reach beneath his own outstretched arm. Was she giving up and running? Minato could have rejoiced, except his body was determined to give chase. As Orochimaru's laughter rang out behind them, he sped after her, following the flash of streaming red hair to catch up. It took only a moment to overtake and hit the ground, sliding his legs directly across her path. She tripped and fell forward onto her hands with a squeak, but rather than fall flat where he could pin her, she shifted her momentum into a somersault and rolled straight back to her feet to continue running with barely a break. She was lighter on her feet than he appreciated. He would have smiled if he'd been free to, instead he was forced to rise to his feet once more and continue the chase. At one point she dared glance behind her and her eyes widened to see how close he was. She swerved sharply towards the trees and mounted a trunk with her chakra-charged feet to propel her into the branches. He caught up the same moment she swung down, aiming her feet at his head. Rather than duck, he grabbed her ankles and pulled her to the ground. She didn't stand a chance. And Minato could only watch as he pressed down on her shoulder with one hand and stabbed his kunai into her throat with the other. Kushina exploded in gust of air and smoke. Just a clone. A weight crashed down on him from above, shoving him hard into the ground. With the tiny prick of a blade against his neck, his body wisely went still. Snap out of it, Minato. Kushina yelled into his ear. I'm here to help you. She would never cut into his throat, not even to save her own life. He knew it, and his body did too. He bucked hard, throwing her off his back, and slashed wildly at her. He heard her cry out. Blood flecked the dirt and a deep line of red split her upper arm. Something nearly broke in Minato at the sight, knowing he was responsible, and yet he still pursued her like an automaton, one purpose in his programming and one purpose alone, to kill Kushina. He dived for her again. This time when she slipped back out of reach she opened her palm and Minato was hit full in the face with a blast of her wind chakra. Dust and grit threatened to fill his eyes, and he flinched away, momentarily blinded. And through that maelstrom of air, Kushina came at him. Her blow would have knocked him unconscious, and Minato would have welcomed it. But in that last split second, Minato saw her weakness. Grabbing her arm, he spun and delivered shape jabs with his elbow to her face and chest that must have winded her. She kicked him away, breaking his grip on her arm, and vanished once more into the dust. Minato waited. "You have to give me a break here, Minato," Kushina's voice called. Minato turned, searching for the direction. The dust was clearing but it still lay thick in the air. "We can take down Orochimaru if we work together." One glimpse of red through the makeshift smokescreen and Minato flew on the offensive once more. Kushina had taken her chance to extract a ninjato from a scroll, and she swung it desperately to fend off his kunai. Their blades screeched and clicked in the tranquil morning air, spitting faint sparks as Minato pushed and forced Kushina back. She twisted and blocked. He lunged and battered down every parry. She had always moved like a dancer when she fought, as such was the remnants of her old whirlpool training. It kept her always 1 inch beyond the reach of his blade, and her movements just frenetic and graceful to remain unpredictable. But all dances had their rhythms and patterns, and Minato was quickly learning hers. It wouldn't be long until she slipped. Kushina was a better ninja than average by far, and her foreign fundamentals would always give her a slight edge, yet not even she could keep up with him. Already he could see her tiring, continually breaking away to gain some distance and advantage, only to be pinned once more, trading frantic clashes to keep his blade from sinking into her. One strike was so close that she was only saved from decapitation by virtue of choosing that moment to fall backwards over a poorly placed rock. She rolled quickly to the side to avoid being skewered, and kicked out at his knee to force distance. On her feet, she looked around, finally noticing how close he had driven her to the edge of the gorge. Several hundred yards of freefall awaited her if the pace continued, and Kushina turned to regard him warily. Her skin looked especially pale with the bright blood streaking down her arm. The wound, however, did not look nearly as bad as it had a few minutes ago. It didn't even appear to be bleeding anymore. "I think I've realized something about you," she said, limping faintly as she moved counter to his slow stalking movements. "You haven't once used Hiration, Minato. You haven't used any jutsu at all, even. You can't use your chakra like this, can you?" He knew she was right. While Orochimaru controlled his blood, he didn't control his chakra. There was nothing Minato could do about that except be glad that he could not use ninjutsu against Kushina. She still had little chance against him, against his jutsu she would already have been killed. Kushina glanced over her shoulder at the valley. "If you want me," she said, "you're welcome to come get me." And with that she turned and took a running leap off the cliff. Minato had no time to spare for shock. Without hesitation he plunged over the edge after her, plummeting through the air towards the water-filled basin below. Kushina was below him, tumbling through the air with her hair snatching around her like a living fire. He could see what she planned. She wanted to use the fact that he could no longer walk on water to her advantage. He'd be forced to swim, but if she hit the water first she was going to be incredibly vulnerable when Kushina shot past him. Her descent stopped dead as she opened her palms and directed a wind jutsu straight down. Minato watched in faint disbelief as she changed her trajectory like a leaf bouncing in the wind to land on the vertical cliff face with only the tiniest of wobbles, seconds before his body smashed into the frigid lake. The cold water invaded his nose and eyes. For several horrifying moments, his body didn't seem to know what to do. He hung there, immobile and unable to breathe, feeling the tightening of suffocation in his chest that he couldn't do anything about it. Something seized him around the arm and jerked hard, tugging his whole body along with it through the water. The shining surface of the lake was getting closer, until air broke over his face and suddenly he could breathe again. His arm remained suspended above him, wrapped by a silver chain that he followed all the way to the cliff face where Kushina appeared to be holding the other end. Yet another trick she had kept from him. "I don't suppose you're grateful," she yelled at him. "I just saved your life." Minato grabbed the chain with his other hand and pulled with all his might. She'd let her guard down, and with a faint shriek she came unstuck from the rock wall and fell. The moment the chain went lax, Minato shrugged it free and started swimming hard for the shelf of dry land beneath Kushina. Though she hadn't fallen far, she landed hard, and now she lay as stunned as Minato had been in the water. "Get up," he prayed as he waded out of the lake, great ribbons of water running off his leaden limbs. The ninjato Kushina had dropped and the fall lay nearby, and Minato stooped to pick it up. The chains coming from her body atomized on the ground, nothing but an illusion of chakra disappearing into the air like wisps of smoke. She lifted her upper half off the ground a little dizzily. Had she hit her head? Looking for her weapon. When she saw him approaching with it in his hand, a flash of urgency crossed her face. She scrambled to her feet and fled to the cliff wall. But Minato was faster. The moment her boot hit the rocks and she began to climb, he reached out and snatched a fistful of her hair. With a shout of pain, and fell onto her back before him. Their scuffle was anything but elegant. Kushina rolled up and slammed her feet against his chest, knocking him back but losing several clumps of hair in the process. Minato struck out as he stumbled, slicing the ninjato into the crease behind her knee. Kushina's scream as her leg gave out was almost too much. Minato wished he could close his ears, close his eyes, anything. He would rather turn the blade on himself than cause her pain, but he was still advancing, forcing her up against the base of the escarpment. Blood ran freely down her leg to pool beneath her. It was useless. He'd cut her hamstring and with an injury like that she might never walk again. The horror and guilt at causing such a grievous injury to the one he loved should have swallowed him. At the same time he was holding a sword to her throat, about to kill her. Minato honestly didn't think he was going to be able to live with himself. "Think about what you're doing," Kushina whispered, her breath coming in shallow pants as she pressed herself back against the rock. Her eyes were wide. Confidence had fled, replaced with fear. "I know you can hear me, Minato. You have to fight this. You have to come home with me. I can't lose you. Not now. Not after Sensei." She went silent and squeezed her eyes shut as the blade kissed her throat, drawing beads of red along its edge. If his blood was pumping according to Orochimaru's beat, he didn't care if his heart had to stop, he wouldn't do this. He couldn't. He would sooner die than take her life. The muscles in his arms seized and convulsed. His hand trembled. It took all the strength and will he had, but that blade did not move deeper. He forced his tongue into obedience and demanded his lips move. Though it felt like he was attempting to communicate from the deepest level of anesthesia, he managed to spit the word to life. "Run." Kushina's eyes snapped open to fix on his. If she noticed something different in his, he certainly noticed a difference in hers. Gone were the swirling pools of green and blue that had always commanded his attention. The eyes he looked into were close to that of an animal, narrow, yellow. Fierce. What? Her hand seized around his, over the hilt of the ninjato. "I'm not leaving you," she ground out, and her voice was lower and thicker than he'd ever known it to be. Her nails bit into his skin. Had they always been that long? Kill her. Quickly. Orochimaru was standing beside him. Do it or you'll die. But Minato's hand was being forced back. It wasn't his own will anymore, but Kushina's strength. Her grip was incredible. Orochimaru's jutsu dulled his sense of pain, but he could feel her fingers gauging into the back of his hand and see his skin turning white as she pushed back. Why? Orochimaru was growing impatient. Kill her and you do everyone a favor. An abomination like her should not even exist. Kushina's eyes screwed shut again and her lungs heaved. Was it her chakra that began to flicker over her skin like a visible aura? But Kushina's chakra was blue, not this frothing red that made his hand ache and burn like he'd dipped it in acid. She's nothing but an animal, cornered and fighting for her survival. Put her down, now. Orochimaru screamed at him. It took everything Minato had, more than had ever been demanded of him, to pull back the ninjato and plunge it once and for all into the rock beside Kushina's head. His whole body throbbed. He knew what was going to happen to him now, and his arm had already dropped to his side, ruined. Orochimaru gave a caustic snort of contempt. Then. You're no use to me. You'll die with her, he said, reaching for the blood contract in his pouch. This time when Kushina's eyes slid open, there was nothing in them. Her white, unseeing eyes wandered over him to Orochimaru, and for a few moments it was almost serene. Then she exploded. Waves of heat and noxious chakra blasted Minato, physically pushing him away. He had barely a moment to register the fiery creature at the heart of it when it reached out to grab his leg. And if he ever had bands of white-hot iron wrapped around his flesh, Minato imagined it would feel like this. The pain was so intense he almost blacked out. He knew that he was thrown, tossed aside as easily and indifferently as a twig on the wind. He knew he slammed into the cliff face and landed on his crushed leg. He knew that he was still alive but barely conscious, looking on as the strange alien monster tore through the valley, turning water to steam and rocks to dust as it flayed and belted out agonized, inhuman screams. There was another creature, a snake. Orochimaru's summon. They were fighting. None of what he was seeing made much sense to Minato, and his awareness of it all dimmed intermittently as he faded in and out of consciousness. Where was Kushina? She'd been there only a moment ago. With these monsters tearing around, she might be hurt. It seemed like only a moment later, he opened his eyes and found himself surrounded by moving bodies. He's awake, someone cried out. Minato, can you hear me? Jiraiya loomed above him, filling his vision with shaggy white hair. Minato licked his dry lips. Sensei. He hadn't seen him look this worried since the time he'd almost been assassinated after the Chunin exam. You're going to be all right, Minato, the medics are here, Jiraiya reassured him. We have you now. He couldn't count the number of people around him. He couldn't even make them out. They felt like demons, pulling at his clothes and his body and speaking in low, unintelligible voices Minato wasn't meant to hear. But Minato couldn't have cared less about that. Kushina, where's Kushina? They're subduing her now. Biwako's here, so she'll be all right. We think she gave Orochimaru a hell of a run for his money. Where? Jiraiya looked off to the side and Minato followed his gaze, but all he saw was that monster, trapped against the cliffs on the other side of the basin, encircled by people and ropes that looked like yapping little dogs compared to that thing. Where is she? He demanded. Jiraiya looked at him as if unsure what to say. Minato. That's not Kushina. He struggled to sit up, even though his right side didn't seem to be working. I have to find her. She's hurt. I have to, for God's sake, Minato, don't move. Jiraiya forcefully pushed him back down, though it didn't require much effort. I'm going on ahead. I'll bring that bastard back if it's the last thing I do, so you have to promise me to keep still for the medics. But... Kushina. He whispered. Someone else leaned over him to peer a light into his eyes. He thought he might have heard the word concussion. And maybe shock, too. You can save his leg, can't you? He heard Jiraiya ask. The daylight was fading, making it difficult to see who was talking anymore. The leg is the least of his worries. The poison's spreading. If we don't get him back, whatever you have to do. Do it. Jiraiya touched Minato's shoulder gently. I'll be back, kid. And then he was gone. Namikaze-san, we're going to sedate you. An echoing scream like a chorus of tortured violins reverberated around the valley. Minato turned his head and witnessed the final thrashing of the monster pinned against the cliffs. It was beginning to slump at last, overwhelmed by the ninja surrounding it. Its tails were beginning to drop and fade, all 5 of them. The medic's needle slid so easily into his neck he didn't feel it until the horrible, too familiar numbness spread through his body, taking away his pain and control once more. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook his vision was the monster. The fox. Kushina. Waking up in the hospital was a long process. He'd been unconscious for several days as his body battled a deadly poison and medics carried out one surgery after another on his leg and arm. Consciousness returned to him in bits and pieces. His earliest recollection was of a couple of nurses, giggling by his bedside and arguing which one had the honor of giving a sponge bath. In all honesty, he counted himself as pretty lucky he didn't recall much after that, until one afternoon he opened his eyes to take a look around him. He saw mounds of flowers piled up on the window ledge and overflowing from his bedside table, as well as an intriguing contraption holding his right knee together. Interesting, he thought, before he passed out again. The next time he woke up was because an unimaginable pain gripped his body. He knew his leg was in pieces because it felt exactly like that, and a fire burned through his veins so ferociously he found it difficult to breathe. He probably cried out. Medical staff came hurrying into the room and began arguing over his shuddering body. One medic said to the other it was his fault for administering the wrong dosage of painkiller. The other medic protested he'd never seen a poison like this, so it wasn't his fault. Eventually, a nurse quietly hooked something to the needle in Minato's arm, and he rapidly fell back into unconsciousness where pain couldn't reach him. The first time he truly woke up was almost a week later. Though he had lost all sense of time, he had a rough idea of how many days had passed based on his itchy beard growth. The first thing he did was scratch his cheek, and his first coherent thought was that now was an opportune time to try out a goatee. Kushina might not take kindly to bristly kisses, however. Triggered memories poured back into his mind. His hand dropped slowly to his side as he suddenly remembered that kisses, bristly or otherwise, were the least of his worries right now. Hey! The small voice startled Minato. He blinked and rolled his head on the pillow to look at the small boy sitting in the visitor's chair, feet kicking gently against its legs. Kakashi looked well, considering, but the last time Minato had seen him was at Tsukumo's memorial service. Hey, Minato responded, voice rough and dry. All right there, Kakashi? Kakashi's legs stopped moving and he gave Minato a surprisingly stern look for an 8-year-old, one which questioned how appropriate it was for a man strung up in a hospital bed with steel pins sticking out of his leg to ask his visitor if he was all right. I'm fine, he said flatly after a while. Your leg is kind of shattered though. Oh. Minato looked down at the cage around his knee. It looked incredibly painful, which made Minato very appreciative of whatever drugs were plugged into him. And your arm is, like, black, Kakashi added, pointing to his right arm that had been so thoroughly bandaged from fingertip to shoulder that it was impossible to tell what color it was. Minato couldn't move it either way. Makes a change, Minato said, a little relieved that he could still wiggle his fingers. And you were poisoned pretty bad, Kakashi went on. The doctor says your heart stopped a couple of times. His thoughts rattled around, trying to remember how he had come to be poisoned. I like to keep people on their toes, he said. But you're okay now, right? Kakashi asked, a faintly anxious note in his voice that Minato almost missed. Yeah, I'm okay, Minato said, smiling at him. It's nice you came to visit. Jiraiya said you should always have at least one person with you at all times, Kakashi said sagely. He says the nurses can't be trusted with you. I don't know why. I've never seen them steal anything. Minato had a few snatches of memory that made him wonder if Kakashi had instead been charged to protect Minato's virtue rather than his valuables. Thanks, I guess, he said to his young chaperone. Where is Jiraiya? He came with me a while ago, but he had to leave. I think he's with the Hokage. Kakashi cocked his head. That snake guy got away. He must be really strong. He beat the Hokage and Jiraiya and you too. They don't look as bad as you, though. Minato lifted an eyebrow, just about the only part of him that didn't ache to move. Orochimaru didn't do this to me. Yeah. I know. Kakashi filled his cheeks with air, slowly blew it out as his gaze wandered around the room. Every time he looked at the fountain of flowers that surrounded his bed, the boy's nose twitched. Kushina had once mentioned his allergies. Where's Kushina? Minato asked him steadily, holding on tight to the ball of anxiety inside him that threatened to unravel just speaking her name. Kakashi shrugged. Has she been by? Kakashi awkwardly looked away and shrugged again. Not really. She's okay. Her leg, I mean. Her leg? Kakashi shot him a puzzled look. Is there something wrong with it? She's not said anything about it. Well, considering Minato had hamstringed her and by all rights she shouldn't have been able to walk, Kakashi couldn't have missed it. Unless she was in fact, just fine. Has she been released from the hospital? Was never in it, said Kakashi. Minato suddenly felt very tired. He stared up at the ceiling, noticing an old water stain in the shape of a banana that almost every single patient in this bed before him must have seen too. Never gets sick, he thought to himself. Never needs time off to heal. After a while he cleared his rasping throat. You're my student now, he said to Kakashi. How about you do your sensei a favor and get me a can of mint pop from the vending machine? We'll call it your first-class mission. Kakashi held out his hand. Money. Minato must have left his change in his other scanty hospital gown. I'll pay you back later. This can be your first lesson. A ninja must always carry money or be prepared to procure it on short notice. With a faint roll of his eyes, Kakashi slipped off the chair and headed for the door. Diet, please, Minato called after him. Yes, sensei. Kakashi closed the door after him, leaving Minato alone in his quiet little hospital room. By the time he came back, Minato was fast asleep again. His next visitor didn't arrive till the following day, and in the interim Minato put up with the poking and prodding of various doctors and medics. Several appeared to have been assigned to him, and they routinely came in one after another, asking the same questions and messing with the same sore spots as the ones before. He had a feeling many more who weren't assigned to him dropped by purely to eyeball his injuries. Doctors were weird like that. A beautiful artwork wouldn't turn their heads, but if they heard some guy had come in with a leg so badly broken it was shaped like an S, they all came running to take pictures for their scrapbook. By evening, he was glad to be left alone to sleep. But without sedation his dreams came too close to the surface and became nightmare. They took him back to unwelcome memories and unwanted feelings where he was trapped in a dark place, his own body, looking down at himself but unable to move. Just one among many bodies in an abattoir, praying for release even if that meant death. His own helplessness surrounded him like a cage, pressing in around him and crushing him until he could hardly breathe. The sound of a chair leg scraping against the floor broke him free, and he snapped awake, heart thundering in his chest. Before he could face the person sitting beside his bed, he had to take a deep breath and remind himself of reality. He was free. He was in the hospital. The smell of Orochimaru's lab still hung in his nose, but it was a phantom and nothing more. Sliding a finger across the perspiration on his brow, Minato sighed and looked at his visitor. "Good evening," said the Hokage, tipping his hat. Minato nearly broke his other leg in his rush to sit up, bow, salute, whatever. "Sir," he gasped. The Hokage reclined comfortably in his chair. "Please relax. There are many doctors here who would be very unhappy with me if I were to cause any sort of relapse. You've been distracting nurses all week." "Sorry," said Minato humbly. "Well, of course." Sarutobi removed his hat slowly and placed it on his lap, which seemed a rather informal thing for him to do. "I heard you were up and talking, so I thought I'd come see you. How are you feeling?" "Not bad, but I think that's mostly because of this stuff," he said, hooking a finger around his foretube. "The leg looks worse than it feels." "Metal plates?" inquired the Hokage. "Yes, sir." "Snap," he said, tapping his own arm. "When the drugs wear off it'll really start hurting, I promise." "Thank you, sir," said Minato uneasily, having trouble imagining a worse pain than when he'd broken it. With a wan smile, the Hokage looked down at the hat in his lap. One finger tapped the rim speculatively. "I'm afraid what's happened to you is mostly my fault, Minato. My conscience has been weighing heavily on me." "No, Hokage-sama," he said quickly. "I was injured because I—" "Because?" Sarutobi tilted an ear towards him. But Minato couldn't think why he'd been injured. His memory of events was perfect, but jumbled, like a complete jigsaw puzzle that had been dropped and was waiting to be put back in order. He knew what had happened to him, but he was not picking those pieces up yet. He didn't want to. "You're not responsible, sir. I made an error. I think you should know that Orochimaru has evaded us. I've sent all the people I can spare to track him down, but even with a full division I fear it would be useless. I taught him a little too well. But I never considered he could become so twisted." Minato looked down at his hands. The medics had removed some of his bandages earlier, and now his bruised, mottled flesh was bared for all to see. White fingers touched black fingers, and he still had trouble acknowledging they were his own. "None of us knew, Hokage-sama. We all share the blame. His laboratory is being dismantled as we speak," the Hokage continued. "There were some survivors. A few small children. A couple of adults. They're here in the hospital too, but I've been told not to expect them to last much longer. Orochimaru's experiments have been protracted. Evil. I always knew he had an unhealthy fixation on chasing immortality, but I never expected him to go this far." "How many has he killed?" Minato asked. "We found the remains of more than 60 children and over 300 adults. There were undoubtedly more, but it'll be a while before the rest of his journals are properly explored. However, I'm already told that you were mentioned in his notes dating back many years." "Probably. He said he wanted to possess me," Minato said, hunching his shoulders. "I thought he was just mad." "Maybe. He used a blood contract on you, didn't he?" "I don't know what it was," Minato said more tersely than was allowed when speaking to the Hokage. However, thinking about what Orochimaru had done to him and made him do were just more pieces that Minato wanted to leave on the ground where he didn't have to look at them. "It's a forbidden jutsu I once told him about. The preparation is painstaking. He must have planned to take you many years in advance. Although I don't understand how he would have gotten his hands on enough of your blood." Minato's jaw locked. "A couple of years ago I gave some to him." The Hokage blinked. "Why would you do that?" "He asked for it," Minato replied plainly, and when realizing that answered nothing, he shrugged helplessly. He said it would help me find my father. I didn't think there was any reason not to believe him. And yes, I feel really stupid now. The Hokage leveled him a look of deep appraisal. Orochimaru took hundreds of people through all kinds of means. But to use this jutsu on you? I think more than anyone, more than even me or Jiraiya, Orochimaru might have feared you the most if he went to such lengths to subdue you. Yeah, I'm real dynamo, said Minato flatly, moving his right leg just enough for the hinges of his caged knee to squeak pathetically. Tremble before me and my catheter. We both know Orochimaru didn't do this to you, said the Hokage quietly. His mistake was in thinking there was no one else more powerful than you in the village who would oppose him. It was like feeling a great hand reach inside him to prise the puzzle piece out of his clenched fist to show him what he dared not look at. Minato cleared his throat. I'm sorry, Hokage-sama, but I'm very tired, he said pointedly. He hoped the old man would get the hint. The Hokage sighed. Once more he donned his hat and stood up. Minato, you're the only one who remembers what happened in that valley. Kushina may have walked out in one piece, but she didn't escape unharmed. If either of you are going to heal, you need to do it together. The Hokage left him to his rest, though truthfully Minato did not sleep for most of that night. Call 2, raise 6. Ugh, he's bluffing. That's such a bluff. I think what Inoichi means is that he's folding, Shikaku said, reaching out to take his teammate's hand of cards. Inoichi yanked them out of reach. I'm calling it, he said adamantly. All in. You'll regret it, Chuza said as he himself folded. His pile of winnings had been growing smaller for some time now, not necessarily because he was losing but because they were edible. None of them had much money to begin with, so all they had to play for was a bag of jelly beans that some well-wisher had left by the bed. It took a moment for Minato to realize the reason why everyone had gone quiet was because they were waiting for him. Shikaku nudged his leg pointedly, the healthy one, fortunately. Minato blinked absently at his cards. He'd long since forgotten what form they had decided to play. I fold, he said. They all turned to the last player, who easily held the largest pile of jelly beans on the table. Because of his allergies, the nurses had taken pity on him and given him one of their hygiene face masks to protect him from the flowers that had begun to dominate Minato's hospital room, turning it into a botanical wonder. On the plus side, Kakashi was no longer wheezing. The downside was that he had one hell of a poker face already and the mask just made it worse. Well? Inoichi demanded. Kakashi calmly laid his hand down. Royal flush, Minato commented, amused. Damn it. Inoichi watched in despair as the 8-year-old dragged the last of his beans towards him. That kid has to be cheating. Well, duh, said Chuza. We're ninja, Inoichi, that's the point, Shikaku said. We're all cheating. Even Minato. Sorry, said Minato, peeling back his blanket to reveal the hidden stash of cards lying on his stomach. That's a pretty lousy hand for a cheat, Inoichi told him. Do you even know how to play poker? Poker? I thought we were playing twist. That would be whist, corrected Shikaku. Inoichi was disgusted nevertheless. Not only was being whipped by an 8-year-old taking its toll, but losing to someone who didn't even know what game they were playing had to be pretty demoralizing. I swear, if whatever knocked his leg off knocked something loose in his head, we wouldn't be able to tell. You're such a flake, Minato. The great thing about opiates was that Minato was not inclined to care. I think it's my turn to deal, he said. And though he may not have known the rules that well and the other players watched him like hawks, he still managed to slip most of the aces into Kakashi's hand. So when do the docs say you can go back to work? Chuza asked him. The same day they figure out he's faking, said Inoichi. Minato ignored him. Could be a couple of months, but they're always overly cautious. The next surgery is the last one, then they'll decide whether to take the leg off or let me walk home. In the grim silence, Kakashi pushed 2 beans forward. Called, Minato met the bet. You seem pretty calm about this, Shikaku said. You could really lose your leg? Minato shrugged. If I do, I can always run away and join an order of monks. I know this fire temple guy who, if I were you, I'd be pissing with rage at Orochimaru. All of us want to see that guy hanged, but you probably have more reason than us, yet you seem pretty chill about the whole thing, Inoichi said. I mean, the dude busted your leg and took your girlfriend hostage. I thought he took Minato hostage and Kushina saved him, Chuza interrupted. Shikaku shook his head, you guys are all wrong. Kushina and Minato were fighting him when he summoned some weird monster thing that did in Minato and he got away. Isn't that right, Minato? I don't really remember, he said. There were so many stories of what had happened that night floating about that Minato didn't need to add his own version, especially when he himself wasn't sure if it was any more or less true than the rest. Inoichi sighed melodramatically, I don't think I like living in a world where the godly yellow flash can be reduced to this cripple we see before us who sucks at poker. I'd say we better catch that bastard soon, but he took down the Hokage and Jiraiya as well on the same night. I don't think even 100 men would be enough. Don't worry about Orochimaru, Minato said with serene assuredness. He had the element of surprise this time and he got the jump on me. But next time we cross paths I'll kill him. Check. Check, Kakashi agreed. Shikaku tapped his cards. I'm checking too, he said dully, more affected by Minato's words than his bad hand. He sounded downright prophetic. Chuza cleared his throat and changed the heavy conversation. So what does Kushina think of your new beard? Oh, so that's what it is, Shikaku remarked. I thought the nurses were playing some kind of prank on you. I don't know what she thinks, said Minato. I haven't seen her. What, at all? Shikaku shared a significant look with his teammates. She hasn't come to see you? Not yet. How many points do I get for a joker? You don't get points in poker, and you shouldn't even have the joker. Inoichi's head slammed into his hands in despair. Maybe she's squeamish about the sight of blood, Chuza suggested, and that's why she hasn't visited yet. Odd, since she doesn't hesitate to spill it, Shikaku murmured. I'm sure she's just busy, Minato said. Of course, said Chuza. There's a war on, so everyone's busy. Minato cast an eye around the other players. Well, almost everyone. We'll have you know that we're actually very busy. We're on a mission right now, in fact, said Inoichi. The other Jonin wanted an assessment of your fitness, Shikaku added. And you volunteered? Minato cocked an eyebrow. Or did you draw the short straw? Shikaku shrugged. Something like that. And your verdict? You're a lost cause obviously, especially against this hand. Shikaku threw down his cards with a flourish. Full house, ladies. You're all bust. Chuza slumped back as Inoichi bitterly saw his last jelly beans departing. But just as Shikaku began pulling the pile towards him, a small hand reached out and stopped him. They all looked at Kakashi. Four of a kind, said the boy. To see the smirk slide off Shikaku's face with a hurriedly averted "fu-udge," made Inoichi much happier. With all the jelly beans in Kakashi's possession, and reasonably satisfied that they could report back to their superiors about Minato's fitness, whether it was physical or mental they were concerned about, the Inoshikacho triad soon departed. Minato was tired enough to be relieved. We make a pretty good hustling team, Kakashi, he said. We should do that more often. Sure, sensei, said Kakashi, pushing the bag of sweets back towards Minato. You can have my share. You don't want it? You want it. I don't like sweets. All 8-year-old boys like sweets, Kakashi, Minato told him. Take off that mask and help yourself. Sweets are for children, sensei. Nevertheless, he unhooked his mask. At least 4 cards fell out. And you're not a child, I suppose? Wondered Minato. No. I'm emancipated. It was probably the biggest word he knew too. Minato sighed inwardly. You know, you don't have to live at the center. Me and Kushina have plenty of room. I just sleep at the center. I don't live there. Even so. Kushina hated it there. If she'd had an alternative, I don't mind it. Kakashi said impassively. But he couldn't have been happy there. Minato remembered the center well, although he considered that it might have changed since the days it was overcrowded with an influx of whirlpool orphans. It had to be hard to come down from living in a large home filled with love and privilege, to living in a center where a shoebox was all you had to call your own. Why do it? Unless that was the point. Maybe Kakashi didn't want to be happy. Why didn't you tell your friends that Kushina was the one who hurt you? Kakashi asked suddenly. Why would you think that? Minato asked, collecting the cards diligently to pack away. The boy shrugged. He kept looking at a bunch of lush tiger lilies on the nightstand and their dangling pods of pollen. His nose was twitching. I won't keep you here all day, Minato told him. You can go if you like. I need a rest anyway. Yes, sensei. Kakashi headed for the door. If you see Kushina, Kakashi paused and looked back at him, but Minato couldn't think what to say next. His hand had paused on a queen, noticing that while the woman's image on the top was a flawless, gently smiling lady, her reverse image was crumpled and creased almost beyond recognition by an overzealous hand, no doubt Inoichi's. Sensei? Kakashi prompted him again. Never mind, he said, swiftly disappearing the ruined queen into the rest of the deck. It's not important. The crutches were a blessing when he received them, though the medical staff came to rue it rather quickly. Just days after his last surgery, when the ghoulish cage was removed and the interesting pattern of claw-shaped scars disappeared beneath the final cast, Minato was frequently seen hopping around the hospital despite being ordered to strict bed rest. The head nurse of his ward despaired every time she saw him. You're supposed to be resting, she cried whenever she saw him hobbling about. I'm exercising, he retorted cheerfully. You'll do yourself another injury like that, go back to bed this instant. She was the kind of nurse who approached all her naughty patients as she did her half-dozen naughty teenage sons. Just going down to the canteen, I'll be back in a minute. Don't make me pull rank on you. Can't pull what you can't catch. He was as remarkably fast on 2 crutches as he was on 2 legs, but not so fast he couldn't pull to an awkward stop. That may have come out wrong. When you fall and break that pretty neck of yours, don't expect me to come running. In truth, while hobbling around on crutches gave him a much-needed sense of freedom, it was also incredibly tiring with a leg that either felt like it was on fire or like a deadened lead weight, depending on how much painkiller he had been given. Still, anything to keep him from being confined to a bed was welcome, for when he was confined on his back it was too easy to remember other ways he'd been confined recently. It was not what the doctor had ordered, but Minato preferred to stay active, poking his nose into various corners of the hospital. Here he got a good idea of how the war was developing. Fewer nin were appearing in the emergency unit with injuries less severe than they'd been before, and their news was a lot more optimistic too. The push against IWA had been relatively successful, or at least they'd been fought to a standstill in the borderlands. Konoha was still disadvantaged, and still they awaited Kumo's move with great apprehension, but even if this was just the short minute when the sun broke through the clouds on a long, stormy day, people's spirits were higher. Minato dropped by on Anko a few times before she was released. She would always be cursed it seemed, but she was easily the happiest child in the hospital. No matter what Minato said, all she knew was that Orochimaru had been driven off the night Minato had gone after him, and that made him a big damn hero. I wish you'd kinda killed him though, she said frankly, on the day she was discharged. For someone so small and innocent looking, she had quite a bloodthirsty streak. I'm getting round to it, he promised. Of the people transferred out of Orochimaru's labs, only one survived. A small boy around the same age as Enko, dangerously underfed and neglected. It was difficult visiting him. The boy wouldn't or couldn't talk and didn't appear to have been taught how to read or write. He could at least comprehend what was said to him, and although his cheeks were gaunt and he must have been subjected to horrors that plenty of adults would have trouble coping with, he was able to smile. Given a set of colored crayons, he wasn't that much different from any other child, as long as one did not look too closely at the drawings his imagination produced. Gene-spliced, said the geneticist who had been called in after the notes Orochimaru had made on his child subjects had surfaced. We think this one was spliced with DNA from the first Hokage. He would have been taken as a baby, so it's amazing he's survived this long. All the others like him died. It could be a while before we find out his real name, if ever. It was when Minato was relaxing one day in the hospital's foyer, having just charmed a can of soda out of the vending machine, what the nurses called it when a penniless Minato stared forlornly at the machine long enough until someone took pity on him, that Ren appeared. At first he hoped the other Jonin would simply walk right by without noticing. It wasn't that Minato hated him, or that Ren was in any way a bad person, quite the opposite, only every time Minato saw him he was nagged by guilt. He was always convinced that this time would be the time Ren finally socked him. Any hope of avoiding a confrontation was dashed the moment he went to the front desk and the treacherous receptionist pointed Minato out. You look well, Ren greeted him politely. Thank you, said Minato, equally as polite. Scratching his eyebrow awkwardly, Ren said, last time I saw you, I think you tried to kill me. Minato took a calm sip of his soda. No hard feelings? So you were aware of your actions? He said that like he might be planning to arrest Minato depending on his answer. A little. Not that I was in control. I'd never really try to kill you, Ren. Ren frowned, perhaps wondering about the odd emphasis placed on really. As if Minato would or had tried to kill him before in less serious ways that he might not have noticed. That's comforting. Was there something you needed? Minato asked him. Actually, I thought maybe there was something you needed, Ren said, reaching for the pocket of his vest. I'm being dispatched tomorrow, so I thought I should give you these now. A small sheaf of paper squares was pressed into Minato's open palm. The seal stenciled onto each reminded him of Ofuda charms. Well, thank you, he said uncertainly. Most people just got me flowers though. They're not for you, said Ren quickly. They're really for Kushina, but it's best if the person closest to her has them on hand. My aunt used to give them to Hatake Sakumo, but since he's passed I guess the responsibility now falls to you. And what are they? Minato asked bluntly. They're chakra nullification tags. They'll stop a Jinchuriki's transformation dead if used in time, or else we get a situation like before where it took 20 people to subdue her, and she wasn't even fully transformed yet. Minato regarded them blankly. And what does this have to do with Kushina? I was told you knew, Ren said slowly, his expression turning confused. Knew what? Minato asked, a subtle bite to the edge of his words. I can't tell the difference between memory and imagination. You'll have to enlighten me. Ren glanced at his leg. I don't think your injuries look very imaginary to me. Minato stared at him for a beat before he mustered all the limited grace he possessed and pushed himself to his feet. You know what? This isn't my problem, he said, tossing the tags back at Ren who unsuccessfully tried to catch them as they fluttered away in multiple directions. I bet you've all had a good time laughing behind my back, and it sure was fun having my leg nearly ripped off in order to be let into your little Nitano club, but this isn't my responsibility. If you want someone to trail around after Kushina with a leash so she won't dismember any more people, go elsewhere. I am not going to be her keeper. He gathered his crutches and resolutely began limping away. Minato, don't be like this, Ren beseeched, giving up on collecting all the fallen tags. I've been where you are now, I know it isn't easy. When I found out I could barely believe it either, and it messes with your head. You think you know her better than anyone else, then suddenly you find out this huge secret, and you realize what you fell in love with wasn't the whole picture, and you wonder if she's really the same girl. Please don't tell me how I'm supposed to feel, Minato tossed over his shoulder. You can't run away from this, Ren warned him. I can run away from you. Good enough. He'd never been good at confrontations. But Ren was right. He couldn't avoid the biggest one that was yet to come. Mikoto announced herself with a shy knock on his open door. I'm not disturbing you, am I? Until that point, Minato had only been staring out of his window, trying hard not to think too much about the itch beneath his cast that he couldn't scratch, or much about anything else for that matter. Mikoto, he greeted, tired, but not too tired to smile. I thought I'd stop by, see how you were, she said, coming into the room. I'm fine, I'm just sticking around for the food in this place, he said, pushing himself upright. I'm not going to be here much longer. They're discharging you? Mikoto asked, surprised. Well, technically no. But Minato was determined to be discharged, even if it meant discharging himself out the window while the head nurse's back was turned. They think I'm making a great recovery, he said instead, which was essentially true. To be honest, I thought you were deployed with everyone else. I wasn't expecting to see you. Mikoto smiled thinly. Deployed? No, not me. There was something strange about that smile. She'd suddenly gone so quiet that he wondered if she had really meant to come to see him. A piece of pink, folded paper lay in her hand, and Minato had been here long enough to recognize a hospital document. Is everything okay, Mikoto? Were you here to see someone else? For a second, she lifted her hand as if to brush off the question with a denial. Then she went quiet again, looking down at her lap. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have come. The last thing you need is to be burdened with my problems. So, is this about Kushina? He asked, interrupting her lurch for the door. She looked back at him, blinking in surprise. Kushina? What? No. Her eyes fell again. Well, yes, I suppose. Minato sighed. Ultimately everything seemed to come down to that girl. Picking up the crutch stretched out beside him, he used it to knock the chair back invitingly. Have a seat. I'm not going anywhere. After a brief hesitation, Mikoto deposited herself in the chair and sat twisting her fingers over her knees. When she met his eyes, she flushed with embarrassment. You probably think I'm being silly. I guess that depends on what the problem is, he said. If I tell you, can you promise not to tell Kushina? This was something she couldn't tell her best friend. Minato was not feeling too hot about secrets these days, but he nodded for the sake of hearing her out. Taking a deep breath, she looked up at the ceiling. I came to see you because I already had an appointment here. You're sick? Minato blurted, feeling a cold creep of dread. No. No. Not sick. I'm, Her fingers were twisting quite violently now. I mean, me and Fugaku are going to have a baby. It took Minato several moments to get over his astonishment. Congratulations, he cried. But when Mikoto only gave a watery smile in response, he wondered if that was a bit too much of a hasty assumption. This is good, right? Oh, yes, she agreed. Very good. I'm very happy. Terrified, and I'm not sure I'm ready for this, and I'm bound to mess up, but it's a good kind of fear, you know? Like jumping off the high dive. I feel like I want to tell everyone I meet, but the first person I want to tell. I'm not sure she'll take it well. You don't think Kushina will be happy for you? I'm not sure. I know she hates Fugaku, she's offered to neuter him more than once to his face to stop exactly this from happening. But more than that, I think it would hurt her even if she approved of my husband. You know how she is about children." Minato stared at her. He had to shrug and shake his head. "I thought she liked children." "She does. She loves them. That's the problem though, isn't it?" Mikoto looked at him expectantly. They were the two people closest to Kushina, so why did it feel like they were on a completely different page? "I don't understand, what's the problem?" he asked. Mikoto's face clouded over with confusion. "You've discussed children with Kushina before," she said slowly. "I mean, if she was going to tell anyone, would have thought she would tell you." "I'm beginning to realize I shouldn't be surprised about what kind of things Kushina hasn't told me," he said stiffly. Mikoto didn't deserve his anger, so he fought hard to push those thoughts aside. "Why exactly would Kushina be bothered by your being pregnant?" Mikoto gave him a steely look. "I'm only telling you this because I know how serious you are about her and you have a right to know. I could slap that girl for keeping it to herself, though I can't say that it's not understandable." She drew in a sigh and placed a hand against her gently curving stomach. Almost unconsciously. Now that he knew she was pregnant, it was obvious. But Minato had never been particularly observant of the changes in other women's figures. "Kushina can't have children, Minato." He blinked once. Twice. "What?" "She told me a long time ago. We were talking about the future and when we started talking about family she got upset." Mikoto shook her head sadly. "She said she has a condition that makes it too dangerous to bear children. She wouldn't say what exactly, but I know she meant it. If she gets pregnant, she'll die." "Die?" Of course she had a condition. A monstrous, lethal, terrorizing condition. How could someone like that have a child? It only made sense, but... Minato was too stunned to speak. It was rapidly becoming clear that everything he had known about Kushina, and everything he had expected of their future together, that wasn't going to happen. "I'm sorry," Mikoto said quietly. "But you need to know that. Maybe Kushina kept quiet because she knows it's a deal-breaker for a lot of guys, but... I have a good feeling about you, Minato. If anyone could accept her as she is, it's you." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was no way she could understand just exactly how much he was expected to accept about Kushina, and yet her words didn't ring any less true. Who else loved her more than he did? Who else did he love more than her? "If you want me to keep your baby a secret from Kushina," he said after a while, "I will, but that's a pretty big secret and you can't hide it forever." "I know, I feel terrible," she said miserably, "but I just need time, and the right moment. She should understand. She's bound to be keeping a few secrets of her own from you too, right? A secret bigger than another life inside you?" "I doubt that," she laughed. Now it was Minato's turn to smile painfully. "I'm sure that as long as you are happy, Kushina would be happy for you too." "Thank you, Minato." She smiled gratefully. "I wasn't sure, but actually I do feel better now. I'll let you get your rest." Minato was a long way off that. As Mikoto rose and started for the door, he stopped her again. "Do you have any idea where Kushina is now?" he asked. She pursed her lips. "I guess, last I saw her, she was heading to the cemetery. That was about 2 hours ago, but she may still be there. That's where his grave is, you know." "Sakumo-sensei's." He nodded. "Thank you. And what exactly do you need to know this for?" "I doubt they'll discharge you today." Minato just smiled. Sneaking out of a hospital shouldn't have been that hard, not for a guy who had escaped at least 2 enemy bases in his time. The problem lay in how that guy had 2 working legs, Minato only had 1. Bribing one of the nurses with a bag of chocolate someone had left him was easy, a few more charming compliments about her hair, and she was more than happy to fetch his clothes out of storage. Getting into them was a little trickier. He ended up having to slice off most of the right leg of his pants in order to fit them over his cast. It was either that or walk out the hospital in a dress. But with his clothes on, moving through the hospital was not so easy anymore. If the head nurse saw him heading down the elevator with his jacket on, she would know he wasn't just popping down for the vending machines. With that in mind, he applied a simple henge. Namikaze Minato might be buried beneath a dog pile of medics and nurses before he got to the entrance, but no one would think twice about a brunette limping out on crutches. As he limped through the streets, it occurred to him that the doctors weren't just trying to keep him in bed to inconvenience him. Sadists they may have been, but they also had a point. Minato's leg hurt like hell, and the half-mile trip to the cemetery felt not unlike a transcontinental trek. By the time he reached the iron gates marking the entrance, he had convinced himself that she wouldn't be there and that he was torturing himself needlessly. Yet he wasn't all that surprised when, between the tall tombs and grave makers, he saw a glimpse of red hair. He found her sitting on the sparse grass before a modest tombstone. 2 names were engraved, a married couple, although until recently one of names would have been marked in red to show he still lived. But now the paint had been washed away and they finally rested together in peace, Hatake Tsukumo and his wife. A bouquet of white flowers rested at the base of the stone, probably placed there by Kushina, who was too lost in her own thoughts to hear or recognize Minato approaching from behind. He stopped a few feet away, shifting his weight onto his good leg. Fortunately, it wasn't a windy day. One stout breeze might just knock him off his pegs. "So you're a Jinchuriki." Kushina didn't turn around, but he saw her stiffen as if he'd crashed a pair of cymbals behind her head. "And you're not just any Jinchuriki, are you?" he went on. "You're the Kyubi. I don't really know how it happened, but I guess it was when your village was attacked. Your dad didn't seal his techniques into you, that was just some crap you fed me to shut me up. No, your dad actually sealed the 9-tailed bijou into you, and that's why you never get sick. That's why you can break your nose one day and the next day barely have a bruise. That's why the Hokage declared a state of emergency when you went missing. That's why Orochimaru didn't want to face you. He was scared of you." Rising slowly, Kushina wiped something from her face that might have been tears. When she turned, he expected to see her usual steely defiance, but what he saw was just a shattered remnant of it. One gust of wind could knock him down. One cruel word would destroy her completely. "Yeah, I'm a freak. I lied to you, and I nearly got you killed," she said, voice more broken and husky than he'd ever heard it. She wiped her pink nose with the back of her hand as water stood out in her eyes. "What do you want me to say?" "Say sorry," he said. "Then I'm sorry," she cried out. "I'm sorry about what I am. Sensei said I had to tell you the truth or leave you, but I was too selfish, even though I knew you see people like me as monsters. Now I've ruined everything and I'm sorry." "I've been in the hospital for 2 weeks, Minato said unsympathetically. "You didn't visit once." She blanched. "Would you even have wanted that?" "You were the only one I wanted there, Kushina. I saw more of your ex than I saw of you." And you're not the only one who has to apologize," he said. "I know I've said some things, in hindsight I guess they must have been pretty insensitive. I always thought Jinchuriki would be like the one I saw in Suna. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry I ever gave you reason to think you couldn't trust me with the truth." She stared at him, eyebrows tilting up in something resembling hope. "You're not mad at me? How could I be? But your leg is healing, and it wasn't your fault. We both did a pretty big number on each other, although fortunately you seem to have some enhanced supernatural healing ability. That's pretty cool." "Cool?" she echoed, bewildered. "Minato, are you really okay with this? With what I am?" "You're Kushina," he said simply. "Nothing's changed. She shifted uneasily. That's what Ren said, but he still ended up treating me like I was a burden, like he couldn't let me go to crowded places in case I snapped and killed everyone. Is that likely to happen? He wondered. Only if my idiot boyfriend tries to kill me again, she told him. He smiled, because he deserved that, and if Kushina was able to joke then things couldn't be so terrible after all. I could get used to the idea of my girlfriend being stronger than me. She rubbed her eyes dry. Your leg is nothing compared to the damage your ego took, right? He snorted. You know me too well. She smiled at last, weakly, but it was the greatest thing Minato had seen since he'd woken up in hospital. Transferring one crutch to his other hand, he held out his arm to her, and she gratefully stepped into his embrace without hesitation. It was a little wobbly, but no less heartfelt, and Minato buried his face in her hair and breathed in its earthy, chilled scent that told him she had been in this graveyard for far too long. She felt so small in his arms, and it was so hard to believe that she held power enough to destroy whole nations. It really would take some getting used to, that was for sure. He pressed his mouth to her ear and kissed it. I love you, he swore, and felt her squeeze him back a little tighter. Now can we go home? My leg is killing me. Yes, let's go home, she agreed with a deep sigh of relief that shed 2 weeks' worth of pain and uncertainty. They were both too tired to say any more. To worry any more. One of them may have been the host of the most fearsome bijou in existence, and the other was destined to become the greatest living Kage, but with his arm draped around her shoulders for support, they tottered home with no greater concern on their minds than what they would have for dinner. Except one. Minato? Yes? What's that stuff on your face? It's my new beard, Kushina. It's not staying, is it? Series ends here. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.